Chapter 1. Please look after this bear. Mr. and Mrs. Brown first met Paddington on a railway platform. In fact, that was how it came to have such an unusual name for a bear, for Paddington was the name of the station. The Browns were there to meet their daughter Judy, who was coming home from school for the holidays. It was a warm summer day, and the station was crowded with people on their way to the seaside. Trains were humming, loudspeakers blaring, porters rushing about shouting at one another, and altogether there was just so much noise that Mr. Brown, who saw him first, had to tell his wife several times before she understood. A bear in Paddington Station. Mrs. Brown looked at her husband in amazement. Don't be silly, Henry. There can't be. Mr. Brown adjusted his glasses. But there is, he insisted. I distinctly saw it. Over there, near the bicycle rack. It was wearing a funny kind of hat. Without waiting for a reply, he caught hold of his wife's arm and pushed her through the crowd, round the trolley laden with chocolate and cups of tea, past the bookstore, through a gap in a pile of suitcases, towards the lost property office. There you are, he announced triumphantly, pointing towards a dark corner. I told you so. Mrs. Brown followed the direction of his arm and dimly made out a small furry object in the shadows. It seemed to be sitting on some kind of a suitcase, and round its neck there was a label with some writing on it. The suitcase was old and battered, and on the side, in large letters, were the words "Wanted on voyage." Mrs. Brown clutched at her husband. Why, Henry, she exclaimed, I believe you're right after all. It is a bear. She peered at him more closely. It seemed a very unusual kind of a bear. It was brown in color, a rather dirty brown, and it was wearing a most odd-looking hat, with a wide brim, just as Mr. Brown had said. From beneath the brim, two large round eyes stared back at her. Seeing that something was expected of it, the bear stood up and politely raised its head, revealing two black ears. Good afternoon, it said in a small, clear voice. Good afternoon, replied Mr. Brown thoughtfully. There was a moment of silence. The bear looked at them inquiringly. Can I help you? Mr. Brown looked rather embarrassed. Well, no, as a matter of fact, we were wondering if we could help you. Mrs. Brown bent down. You're a very small bear, she said. The bear puffed out its chest. I'm a very rare sort of a bear, he replied importantly. There aren't many of us left where I come from. And where is that? Asked Mrs. Brown. The bear looked around carefully before replying. Darkest Peru. I'm not really supposed to be here at all. I'm a stowaway. A stowaway? Mr. Brown lowered his voice and looked anxiously over his shoulder. He almost expected to see a policeman standing behind him with a notebook and pencil, taking everything down. Yes, said the bear. I immigrated, you know. A sad expression came into his eyes. I used to live with my Aunt Lucy in Peru, but she had to go into a home for retired bears. You don't mean to say you've come all the way from South America by yourself? Exclaimed Mrs. Brown. and the bear nodded. Aunt Lucy always said she wanted me to immigrate when I was old enough. That's why she taught me to speak English. But whatever did you do for food? Asked Mr. Brown. You must be starving. Bending down, the bear unlocked the suitcase with a small key, which it also had round its neck, and brought out an almost empty glass jar. I ate marmalade, he said, rather proudly. Bears like marmalade, and I lived in a lifeboat. But what are you going to do now? Said Mr. Brown. You can't just sit in Paddington Station waiting for something to happen. Oh, I shall be alright, I expect. The bear bent down to do up its case again. As he did so, Mr. Brown caught a glimpse of the writing on the label. It said simply, "Please look after this bear, thank you." She turned appealingly to her husband. "Oh, Henry, what shall we do? We can't just leave him here. There's no knowing what might happen to him. London's such a big place when you've nowhere to go. Can't he come and stay with us for a few days?" Mr. Brown hesitated. "But Mary dear, we can't take him. Not just like that, after all." "After all what?" Mrs. Brown's voice had a firm note to it. She looked down at the bear. "He is rather sweet, and he'd be such company for Jonathan and Judy. Even if it's only for a little while, they'd never forgive us if they knew you'd left him here." "It all seems highly irregular," said Mr. Brown thoughtfully. "I'm just there's a law about it." He bent down. "Would you like to come and stay with us?" he asked. "That is," he added hastily, not wishing to offend the bear, "if you've nothing else planned." The bear jumped and his hat nearly fell off with excitement. "Oh, yes, please. I should like that very much. I've nowhere to go, and everyone seemed in such a hurry." "Well, that's settled then," said Mrs. Brown before her husband could change his mind. "And you can have marmalade for breakfast every morning, and..." She tried hard to think of something else that bears might like. "Every morning?" The bear looked as if he could hardly believe its ears. "I only had it on special occasions at home. Marmalade is very expensive in darkest Peru." "Then you shall have it every morning starting tomorrow," continued Mrs. Brown, "and honey on Sunday." A worried expression came over the bear's face. "Will it cost very much?" he asked. "You see, I haven't very much money." "Of course not. We wouldn't dream of charging you anything. We shall expect you to be one of the family." "Shan't we, Henry?" Mrs. Brown looked at her husband for support. "Of course," said Mr. Brown. "By the way," he added, "if you are coming on with us, you'd better know our names. This is Mrs. Brown and I'm Mr. Brown." The bear raised its head politely twice. "I haven't really got a name," he said. "Only a Peruvian one which no one can understand." "Then we'd better give you an English one," said Mrs. Brown. "It'll make things much easier." She looked around the station for inspiration. "It ought to be something special," she said thoughtfully. As she spoke, an engine standing in one of the platforms gave a loud wail, and a train began to move. "I know what," she exclaimed. "We found you in Paddington Station, so we will call you Paddington." Paddington, the bear repeated several times to make sure. It seems a very long name. Quite distinguished, said Mr. Brown. Yes, I like Paddington as a name. Paddington it shall be. Mrs. Brown stood up. Good. Now, Paddington, I have to meet our little daughter, Judy, off the train. She's coming home from school. I'm sure you must be thirsty after your long journey. So you go along to the buffet with Mr. Brown, and he will buy you a nice cup of tea. Paddington licked his lips. I'm very thirsty, he said. Sea water makes you thirsty. He picked up his suitcase, put his hat down firmly over his head, and waved a paw politely in the direction of the buffet. After you, Mr. Brown. Thank you, Paddington, said Mr. Brown. Now, Henry, look after him. Mrs. Brown called after them. And for goodness sake, when you get a moment, take the label off his neck. It makes him look like a parcel. I'm sure he will get put in the luggage van or something if a porter sees him. The buffet was crowded when they entered, but by standing on a chair, Paddington could just rest his paw comfortably on the glass top. He looked around with interest while Mr. Brown went to fetch the tea. The sight of everyone eating reminded him of how hungry he felt. There was a half-eaten bun on the table, but just as he reached out his paw, a waitress came up and swept it into a pan. You don't want that, dearie, she said, giving him a friendly pat. You don't know where it's been. Paddington felt so empty he didn't really mind where he had been, but he was much too polite to say anything. Well, Paddington, said Mr. Brown, as he placed 2 steaming cups of the tea on the table and a plate piled high with cakes. How's that to be going on with? Paddington's eyes glistened. It's very nice, thank you, he exclaimed, eyeing the tea doubtfully. But it's rather hard drinking out of a cup. I usually get my head stuck, or as my head falls in the makes it taste nasty. Mr. Brown hesitated. Then you'd better give me your hat to me. I will pour the tea into a saucer for you. It's not really done in the best circle, but I'm sure no one will mind just this once. Paddington removed his hat and laid it carefully on the table, while Mr. Brown poured out the tea. He looked hungrily at the cakes, in particular at the large cream and jam one which Mr. Brown placed on a plate in front of him. There you are, Paddington, he said. I'm sorry they haven't any marmalade ones, but they were the best I could get. I'm glad I migrated, said Paddington as he reached out a paw and pulled the plate nearer. Do you think anyone would mind if I stood on the table to eat? Before Mr. Brown could answer, he had climbed up and placed his right paw firmly on the bun. It was a very large bun, the biggest and stickiest Mr. Brown had been able to find, and in a matter of moments most of the inside found its way onto Paddington's whiskers. People started to nudge each other and began staring in their direction. Mr. Brown wished he had chosen a plain, ordinary bun, but he wasn't very experienced in the way of bears. He stirred his tea and looked out of the window, pretending he had tea with a bear in Paddington Station every day of his life. Henry! The sound of his wife's voice brought him back to earth with a start. Henry, whatever are you doing, that poor bear? Look at him. He's covered all over the cream and jam. Mr. Brown jumped up in confusion. He seemed rather hungry, he answered lamely. Mr. Brown turned to her daughter. This is what happens when I leave your father alone for 5 minutes. Judy clapped her hands excitedly. Oh, Daddy, is he really going to stay with us? If he does, said Mr. Brown, I can see someone other than your father will have to look after him. Just look at the mess he's in. Paddington, who all this time had been too interested in his bun to worry about what was going on, suddenly became aware that people were talking about him. He looked up to see that Mrs. Brown had been joined by a little girl with laughing blue eyes and long fair hair. He jumped up, meaning to raise his hat, and in his hat slipped on a patch of strawberry jam which he somehow or other had found its way onto the glass tabletop. For a brief moment he had a dizzy impression of everything and everyone being upside down. He waved his paw wildly in the air and then, before anyone could catch him, he somersaulted backward and landed with a splash with his saucer of tea. He jumped up even quicker than he had sat down, because the tea was still very hot, and promptly stepped into Mr. Brown's cup. Judy threw back her head and laughed until the tears rolled down her face. Oh, Mommy, isn't it funny? She cried. Paddington, who didn't think it at all funny, stood for a moment with one foot on the table and the other in Mr. Brown's tea. There were large patches of white cream all over his face, and on his left ear there was a lump of strawberry jam. You wouldn't think, said Mrs. Brown, that anyone could get in such a state with just one bun. Mr. Brown coughed. He had just caught the stern eye of a waitress on the other side of the counter. Perhaps, he said, we'd better go. We will see if I can find a taxi. He picked up Judy's belongings and hurried outside. Paddington stepped gingerly off the table and, with a last look at the sticky remains of his bun, climbed down onto the floor. Judy took one of his paws. Come along, Paddington. We will take you home, and you can have a nice hot bath. I'm sure you must have had lots of wonderful adventures. I have, said Paddington, earnestly. Lots. Things are always happening to me. I'm that sort of a bear. When they came out of the buffet, Mr. Brown had already found a taxi, and he waved them across. The driver looked hard at Paddington, and then at the inside of his nice, clean taxi. Bears is extra, he said gruffly. Sticky Bears is twice as much again. He can't help being sticky, driver, said Mr. Brown. He just had a nasty accident. The driver hesitated. All right, Hotbean, but mine, none of it comes off from the interior. I only cleaned it out this morning. The Brown trooped obediently into the back of the taxi. Mr. and Mrs. Brown and Judy sat in the back, while Paddington stood on the tip-up seat behind the driver, so that he could see out of the window. The sun was shining as they drove up the station, and after the gloom and the noise, everything seemed bright and cheerful. They swept past the group of the people at the bus stop, and Paddington waved. Several people stared, and one man raised his hat in return. It was all very friendly. After weeks of sitting alone in a lifeboat, there was so much to see. There were people and cars and big red buses everywhere. It wasn't a bit like Darkest Peru. Paddington kept one eye off the window in case he misses anything. With his other eye, he carefully examined Mr. and Mrs. Brown and Judy. Mr. Brown was fat and jolly, with a big moustache and glasses, while Mrs. Brown, who was also rather plump, looked like a larger edition of Judy. Paddington had just decided he was going to like staying with the Browns when the glass window behind the driver shut back and a gruff voice said, "Where did you say you wanted to go?" Mr. Brown leaned forward. "Number 32, Windsor Gardens." The driver cupped his ear with one hand. "Can't hear you," he shouted. Paddington tapped him on the shoulder. "Number 32, Windsor Gardens," he repeated. The taxi driver jumped at the sound of the Paddington's voice and narrowly missed hitting a bus. He looked down at his shoulder and glared. "Cream," he said bitterly. "All over me in your coat." Judy giggled, and Mr. and Mrs. Brown exchanged glances. Mr. Brown peered at the meter. He half expected to see a sign go up saying they had to pay another 50 pence. "I beg your pardon," said Paddington. He bent forward and tried to rub the stain off with his other paw. Several burnt crumbs and a smear of jam added themselves mysteriously to the taxi driver's coat. The driver gave Paddington a long, hard look. Paddington raised his hat, and the driver slammed the window shut again. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown. "We really shall have to give him a bath as soon as we get indoors. It's getting everywhere." Paddington looked thoughtful. It wasn't so much that he didn't like baths. He really didn't mind being covered with jam and cream. It seemed a pity to wash it all off quite so soon. But before he had time to consider the matter, the taxi stopped and the Browns began to climb out. Paddington picked up his suitcase and followed Judy up a flight of white steps to a big green door. "Now you're going to meet Mrs. Bird," said Judy. "She looks after us. She's a bit fierce sometimes and she grumbles a lot, but she doesn't really mean it. I'm sure you will like her." Paddington felt his knees began to tremble. He looked around for Mr. and Mrs. Brown, but they appeared to be having some sort of argument with the taxi driver. Behind the door, he could hear footsteps approaching. "I'm sure I shall like her if you say so," he said, catching sight of his reflection on the brightly polished letterbox. "But will she like me?" Chapter 2, A Bear in Hot Water. Paddington wasn't quite sure what to expect when Mrs. Bird opened the door. He was pleasantly surprised when they were greeted by a stout, motherly lady with grey hair and a kindly twinkle in her eyes. When she saw Judy, she raised her hand above her head. "Goodness gracious, you've arrived already," she said in horror. "And me hardly finished the washing up. I suppose you will be wanting tea." "Hello, Mrs. Bird," said Judy. "It's nice to see you again. How's the rheumatism?" "Worse than it's ever been," began Mrs. Bird. Then she stopped speaking and stared at Paddington. "Whatever have you got there?" she asked. "What is it?" "It's not a what," said Judy. "It's a bear. His name's Paddington." Paddington raised his hat. "A bear," said Mrs. Bird doubtfully. "Well, he has a good manners. I will say that for him." "He's going to stay with us," said Judy. "He's immigrated from South America, and he's all alone with nowhere to go." "Going to stay with us?" Mrs. Bird raised her arms again. How long for? Judy looked around mysteriously before replying. I don't know, she said. It depends on things. Mercy me, exclaimed Mrs. Bird. I haven't put clean sheets in the spare room or anything. She looked down at Paddington. Though, judging by the state he is in, perhaps that's as well. It's all right, Mrs. Bird, said Paddington. I think I'm going to have a bath. I had an accident with a bun. Oh, Mrs. Bird had the door open. Oh, well, in the case you'd best come on in. Only mind the carpet. It's just been done. Judy took hold of Paddington's paw and squeezed. She doesn't mind really. She whispered, I think she rather likes you. Paddington watched the retreating figure of Mrs. Bird. She seems a bit fierce, he said. Mrs. Bird turned. What was that you said? Paddington jumped. He began. Where was it you said you'd come from? Peru? That's right, said Paddington. Darkest Peru. Humph. Mrs. Bird looked thoughtful for a moment. Then I expect you like marmalade. I'd better get some more from the grocer. There you are, what did I tell you? Cried Judy as the door shut behind Mrs. Bird. She does like you. Fancy her knowing I like marmalade, said Paddington. Mrs. Bird knows everything about everything, said Judy. Now you'd better come upstairs with me, and I will show you your room. It used to be mine when I was small, and it has lots of pictures of bears around the wall. So I expect you will feel at home. She led the way up a long flight of stairs, chattering all the time. Paddington followed closely behind, keeping carefully to the side so that he didn't have to tread on the carpet. That's the bathroom, said Judy. And that's my room. And that's Jonathan's. He's my brother, and you will meet him soon. And that's my mommy and daddy's. She opened a door. And this is going to be yours. Paddington nearly fell over with surprise when he followed her into the room. He'd never seen such a big one. There was a large bed with white sheets against the one wall, and several big boxes, one with a mirror on it. Judy pulled open the drawer in one of the boxes. This is called the chest of drawers, she said. You will be able to keep all your things in here. Paddington looked at the drawer and then at his suitcase. I don't seem to have very much. That's the trouble with being small. No one ever expects you to want things. Then we shall have to see what we can do, said Judy mysteriously. I will try and get Mommy to take you on one of her shopping expeditions. She knelt down beside him. Let me help you to unpack. It's very kind of you. Paddington fumbled with the lock. But I don't think there's much to help me with. There's a jar of marmalade. Only there's hardly any left now. And what there's the taste of seaweed. And my scrapbook. And some centavos. They are sort of a South America penny. Gosh, said Judy. I've never seen any of those before. Aren't they bright? Oh, I keep them polished, said Paddington. I don't spend them. He pulled out the tattered photograph. And there's a picture of my Aunt Lucy. She had it taken just before she went into the home for retired bears in Lima. She looks very nice, said Judy, and very wise. Seeing that Paddington had a sad, faraway look in his eyes, she added hastily, Well, I'm going to leave you now so that you can have your bath and come down nice and clean. You will find 2 taps, one marked hot and one marked cold. There's plenty of soap and a clean towel. Oh, and a brush so that you can scrub your back. It sounds very complicated, said Paddington. Can't I just sit in a puddle or something? Judy laughed. Somehow, I don't think Mrs. Bird would approve of that. And don't forget to wash your ears. They look awfully black. They are meant to be black, Paddington called indignantly as Judy shut the door. He climbed up onto a stool by the window and looked out. There's a large, interesting garden below, with a small pond and several trees, which looked good for climbing. Beyond the trees, he could see some more houses stretching away into the distance. He decided it must be wonderful living in a house like this all the time. He stayed where he was, thinking about it, until the window became steamed up and he couldn't see out anymore. Then he tried writing his name on the cloudy part with his paws. He began to wish it wasn't quite so long, as it soon ran out of cloud and it was rather difficult to spell. All the same, he climbed onto the dressing table and looked at himself in the mirror. It's a very important name. And I don't expect there are many bears in the world called Paddington. If he'd only known, Judy was saying exactly the same thing to Mr. Brown at the very moment. The Browns were holding a council of war in the dining room, and Mr. Brown was fighting a losing battle. It had been Judy's idea in the first place to keep Paddington. In this, she not only had Jonathan on her side, but also her mother. Jonathan had yet to meet Paddington, but the idea of having a bear in the family appealed to him. It sounded very important. After all, Henry, argued Mrs. Brown, you can't turn him out now. It wouldn't be right. Mr. Brown sighed. He knew when he was bitten. It wasn't that he didn't like the idea of keeping Paddington. Secretly, he was just as keen as anyone. But as head of the Brown household, he felt he ought to consider the matter from every angle. I'm sure we ought to report the matter to someone first, he said. I don't see why, Dad, cried Jonathan. Besides, he might get arrested for being a stowaway if we do that. Mrs. Brown put down her knitting. Jonathan's right, Henry. We can't let that happen. I'm sure he didn't harm anyone traveling in a light boat like that. Then there's a question of pocket money, said Mr. Brown, weakening. I'm not sure how much pocket money to give a bear. He can have £1 a week, the same as the other children, replied Mrs. Brown. Mr. Brown lit his pipe carefully before replying. Well, he said, we'll have to see what Mrs. Bird has to say about it first, of course. There was a triumphant chorus from the rest of the family. You'd better ask her then, said Mrs. Brown when the noise had died down. It was your idea. Mr. Brown coughed. He was a little bit afraid of Mrs. Bird, and he wasn't at all sure how she would take it. He was about to suggest they left it for a little while when the door opened and Mrs. Bird herself came in with a tea thing and looked around at the sea of expectant faces. I suppose, she said, you want to tell me you've decided to keep the young Paddington? May we, Mrs. Bird? Pleaded Judy. Please, I'm sure he'll be very good. Humph, Mrs. Bird put the tray down on the table. That remains to be seen. Different people have different ideas about being good, all the same. She hesitated at the door. He looks the sort of a bear that means well. Then you don't mind Mrs. Bird? Mr. Brown asked her. Mrs. Bird thought for a moment. No, I don't mind at all. I've always had a soft spot for bears myself. It'd be nice to have one about the house. Well, gasped Mrs. Bird as the door closed. Whoever would have thought it? I expect it was because he raised his hat, said Judy. It made a good impression. Mrs. Bird likes polite people. Mrs. Bird picked up her knitting again. I suppose someone ought to write and tell his Aunt Lucy. I'm sure he'd be like to know he's safe. She turned to Judy. Perhaps it would be nice thought if you and Jonathan wrote. By the way, said Mr. Brown, come to think of it, where is Paddington? He's not still up in his room, is he? Judy looked up from the writing desk, where she was searching for some notepaper. Oh, he's all right. He's just having a bath. A bath? Mrs. Brown's face took on a worried expression. He's rather small to be having a bath all by himself. Don't fuss so, Mary, grumbled Mr. Brown, setting himself down in the armchair with a newspaper. He's probably having the time of his life. Mr. Brown was fairly near the truth when he said Paddington was probably having the time of his life. Unfortunately, it wasn't in quite the way he meant it. Blissfully unaware that his fate was being decided, Paddington was sitting in the middle of the bathroom floor, drawing a map of South America with a tube of Mr. Brown's shaving cream. Paddington liked geography. At least he liked his sort of geography, which meant seeing strange places and new people. Before he left South America on his long journey on England, his Aunt Lucy, who was a very wise old bear, had done her best to teach him all she knew. She had told him all about the places he would see on the way, and she had spent many long hours reading to him about the people he would meet. It had been a long journey, halfway round the world, and so Paddington's map occupied most of the bathroom floor, and also used up most of Mr. Brown's shaving cream. With the little that was left and tried writing his new name again. He had several attempts and finally decided on Paddington. It looked most important. It wasn't until a trickle of warm water landed on his nose that he realized the bath was full and was beginning to run over the side. With a sigh, he climbed up onto the side of the bath, closed his eyes, held his nose with one paw, and jumped. The water was hot and soapy, and much deeper than he had expected. In fact, he had to stand on tiptoe even to keep his nose above the surface. It was then that he had a nasty shock. It's one thing getting into a bath. It's quite another getting out. Especially when the water comes up to your nose and the sides are slippery and your eyes are full of soap. He couldn't even see to turn the taps off. He tried calling out help, first in quite a quiet voice, then very loudly. Help! Help! He waited for a few moments, but no one came. Suddenly he had an idea. What a good thing he was still wearing his hat. He took it off and began bailing out the water. There were several holes in the hat, because it was a very old one that had once belonged to his uncle. But if the water didn't get much less, at least it didn't get any more. That's funny, said Mr. Brown, jumping up from his armchair and rubbing his forehead. I could have sworn I felt a spot of water. Don't be silly, dear. How could you? Mrs. Brown, busy with her knitting, didn't even bother to look up. Mr. Brown grunted and returned to his newspaper. He knew he had felt something, but there was no point in arguing. He looked suspiciously at the children, but both Judy and Jonathan were busy writing their letter. How much does it cost to send a letter to Lima? Asked Jonathan. Judy was about to reply when another drop of water fell down from the ceiling, this time right onto the table. Oh gosh, she jumped to her feet, pulling Jonathan after her. There was an ominous wet patch right over their heads and right underneath the bathroom. Where are you going now, dear? Asked Mrs. Brown. Oh, just upstairs to see how Paddington's getting on. Judy pushed Jonathan through the door and shut it quickly behind them. Crikey, said Jonathan. What's up? It's Paddington, cried Judy over her shoulder as she rushed up the stairs. I think he's in trouble. She ran along the landing and banged loudly on the bathroom door. Are you all right, Paddington? She shouted. May we come in? Help, help, shouted Paddington. Please come in, I think I'm going to drown. Oh, Paddington. Judy leaned over the side of the bath and helped Jonathan lift a dripping and very frightened Paddington on the floor. Oh, Paddington, thank goodness you're all right. Paddington lay on his back in the pool of water. What a good job I had in my hat, he panted. Aunt Lucy told me never to be without it. But why on earth didn't you pull the plug out, you silly, said Judy. Oh, Paddington looked crestfallen. I never thought of that. Jonathan looked admiringly at Paddington. Crikey, he said. Fancy you making all this mess. Even I've never made as much mess as this. Paddington sat up and looked around. The whole of the bathroom floor was covered in a sort of white foam where the hot water had landed on his map of South America. It is a bit untidy, he admitted. I don't really know how it got like that. Untidy? Judy lifted him to his feet and wrapped a towel around him. Paddington, we've all got a lot of work to do before we go downstairs again. If Mrs. Bird sees this, I don't know what she will say. I do, exclaimed Jonathan. She says it to me sometimes. Judy began wiping the floor with the cloth. Now, just you dry yourself quickly in case you catch a cold. Paddington began rubbing himself meekly with the towel. I must say, he remarked, looking at himself in the mirror. I am a lot cleaner than I was. It doesn't look like me at all. Paddington didn't look much cleaner than when he had first arrived at the Browns. His fur, which was really quite light in color, and not dark brown as it had been, was standing out like a new brush, except that it was soft and silky. His nose gleamed, and his ears had lost all traces of jam and cream. He was so much cleaner that when he arrived downstairs and entered the dining room some time later, everyone pretended not to recognize him. The tradesman's entrance is at the side, said Mr. Brown from behind the paper. Mrs. Brown put down her knitting and stared at him. I think you must have come to the wrong house, she said. This is number 32, not 34. Even Jonathan and Judy agreed there must be some mistake. Paddington began to get quite worried until they all burst out laughing and said how nice he looked now that he was brushed and combed and respectable. They made room for him in a small armchair by the fire, and Mrs. Bird came in with another pot of tea and a plate of hot buttered toast. Now, Paddington, said Mr. Brown, when they were all settled, suppose you tell us all about yourself and how you came to Britain. Paddington settled back in his armchair, wiped a smear of butter carefully from his whiskers, put his paws behind his head, and stretched out his toes towards the fire. He liked an audience, especially when it was warm and the world seemed such a nice place. I was brought up in darkest Peru, he began. But my Aunt Lucy, She's the one that lives in a home for retired bears in Lima. He closed his eyes thoughtfully. A hush fell over the room, and everyone waited expectantly. After a while, when nothing happened, they began to get restless. Mr. Brown coughed loudly. "It doesn't seem a very exciting story," he said impatiently. He reached across and poked Paddington with his pipe. "Well, I never," he said. "I do believe he's falling asleep." Chapter 3. Paddington Goes Underground. Paddington was very surprised when he woke up the next morning and found himself in bed. He decided it was a nice feeling as he stretched himself and put the sheets up round his head with a paw. He reached out with his feet and found a cool spot for his toes. One advantage of being a very small bear in a large bed was that there was so much room. After a few minutes, he poked his head out cautiously and sniffed. There was a lovely smell of something coming under the door. It seemed to be getting nearer and nearer. There were footsteps too, coming up the stairs. As they stopped by the door, there was a knock, and Mrs. Bird's voice called out, "Are you awake, young Paddington?" "Only just," called out Paddington, rubbing his eyes. The door opened. "You've had a good sleep," said Mrs. Bird as she placed a tray on the bed and drew the curtains. Paddington eyed the tray hungrily. There was half a grapefruit in a bowl, a plate of bacon and eggs, some toast, and a whole pot of marmalade, not to mention a large cup of tea. "Is all that for me?" he exclaimed. "If you don't want it, I can soon take it away again," said Mrs. Bird. "Oh, I do," said Paddington hurriedly. "It's just that I've never seen so much breakfast before." "Well, you'd better hurry up with it." Mrs. Bird turned in the doorway and looked back. "Because you're going on a shopping expedition this morning with Mrs. Brown and Judy. And all I can say is, thank goodness I'm not going to." She closed the door. "Now I wonder what she means by that," said Paddington. But he didn't worry about it for very long. There was far too much to do. It was the first time he had ever had breakfast in bed, and he soon found it wasn't quite so easy as it looked. First of all, he had trouble with the grapefruit. Every time he pressed it with his spoon, a long stream of juice shot up and hit him in the eye, which was very painful. And all the time he was worried because the bacon and egg were getting cold. Then there was a question of the marmalade. He wanted to leave room for the marmalade. In the end, he decided it would be much nicer if we mixed everything up on the one plate and sat on the tray to eat it. "Old Paddington," said Judy when she entered the room a few minutes later and found him perched on the tray. "Whatever are you doing now? Do hurry up. We're waiting for you downstairs. Paddington looked up, an expression of bliss on his face. That part of his face which could be seen behind egg whiskers and toast crumbs. He tried to say something, but all he could manage was muffled grunting noise which sounded like I'm just coming or rolled into one. Really? Judy took out her handkerchief and wiped his face. You are the stickiest bear imaginable, and if you don't hurry up, all the nice things will be gone. Mommy's going to buy you a complete new outfit from Barkeridge's. I heard her say so. Now comb your fur quickly and come on down. As he closed the door, Paddington looked at the remains of his breakfast. Most of it was gone, but there was a large piece of bacon left, which it seemed a pity to waste. He decided to put it into his suitcase in case he got hungry later on. He hurried into the bathroom and rubbed his face over with some warm water. Then he combed his whiskers carefully. And a few moments later, not looking perhaps as clean as he had done the evening before, but quite smart, he arrived downstairs. I hope you are not wearing the hat, said Mrs. Brown as she looked down at him. Oh, do let him, Mommy, cried Judy. It's so unusual. It's unusual, all right, said Mrs. Brown. I don't know that I've ever seen anything quite like it before. It's such a funny shape. I don't know what you'd call it. It's a bush hat, said Paddington proudly. And it saved my life. Saved your life, repeated Mrs. Brown. Don't be silly. How could a hat save your life? Paddington was about to tell her of his adventure in the bath the evening before when he received a nudge from Judy. She shook her head. It's a long story, he said lamely. Then you'd better save it for another time, said Mrs. Brown. Now come along, both of you. Paddington picked up his suitcase and followed Mrs. Brown and Judy to the front door. By the door, Mrs. Brown paused and sniffed. That's very strange, she said. There seems to be a smell of bacon everywhere this morning. Can you smell it, Paddington? Paddington started. He put the suitcase guiltily behind himself and sniffed. He had several expressions which he kept for emergencies. There was his thoughtful expression when he stared into space and rested his chin on a paw. Then there was his innocent one, which wasn't really an expression at all. He decided to use this one. It's very strong, he said truthfully, for he was a truthful bear. And then he added, perhaps not quite so truthfully, I wonder where it's coming from. If I were you, whispered Judy as they walked along the road toward the tube station, I should be more careful in future when you packed your suitcase. Paddington looked down. A large piece of bacon stuck out of the side of his case and was trailing on the pavement. Shoo! Cried Mrs. Brown as a grubby-looking dog came bounding across the road. Paddington waved his suitcase. Go away, dog, he said sternly. The dog licked its lips, and Paddington glanced anxiously over his shoulder as he hurried on, keeping close behind Mrs. Brown and Judy. Oh dear, said Mrs. Brown, I have a funny feeling about today, as if things are going to happen. Do you ever have that feeling, Paddington? Paddington considered for a moment. Sometimes, he said vaguely as they entered the station. At first, Paddington was a little bit disappointed in the underground. He liked the noise and the bustle, and the smell of the warm air which greeted him as they went inside. But he didn't think much of the ticket. He examined carefully the piece of green cardboard which he held in his paw. "It doesn't seem much to get for 80 pence, he said, after all the lovely whirring and clanking noises the ticket machine had made. It didn't seem disappointing. He'd expected much more for his money. "But Paddington," Mrs. Bird sighed, "you only have a ticket so that you can ride on the train. They won't let you on otherwise." She looked and sounded rather flustered. Secretly, she was beginning to wish they had waited until later in the day, when it wasn't quite so crowded. There was also the peculiar business of the dogs. Not one, but 6 dogs of various shapes and sizes had followed them right inside. She had a funny feeling it had something to do with Paddington, but the only time she caught his eyes, it had such an innocent expression she felt quite upset with herself for having such thoughts. "I suppose," she said to Paddington as they stepped on the escalator, "we ought really to carry you. It says you're supposed to carry dogs, but it doesn't say anything about bears." Paddington didn't answer. He was following behind in a dream. Being a very short bear, he couldn't easily see over the side, but when he did, his eyes nearly popped out with excitement. There were people everywhere. He'd never seen so many. There were people rushing down one side, and there were more people rushing up the other. Everyone seemed in a terrible hurry, and he stepped off the escalator. He found himself carried away between a man with an umbrella and a lady with a large shopping bag. By the time he managed to push his way free, both Mrs. Brown and Judy had completely disappeared. It was then that he saw a most surprising notice. He blinked at it several times to make sure, but each time he opened his eyes it said the same thing, "Follow the amber right to Paddington." Paddington decided the underground was quite the most exciting thing that had ever happened to him. He turned and trotted down the corridor, following the amber light, until he met another crowd of people who were queuing for the up escalator. "Here," said the man at the top as he examined Paddington's ticket. "What's all this? You haven't been anywhere yet." "I know," said Paddington unhappily. "I think I must have made a mistake at the bottom." The man sniffed suspiciously and called across to an inspector. "There's a young bear, smelling of bacon, says he made a mistake at the bottom." The inspector put his thumb under his waistcoat. "Escalators is for the benefit and convenience of passengers," he said sternly, "not for the likes of young bears to play on, especially in the rush hour." "Yes, sir," said Paddington, raising his hat, "but we don't have escalators," said the inspector helpfully. "Laters," said Paddington. "In darkest Peru, I've never been on one before, so it's rather difficult." "Darkest Peru," said the inspector, looking most impressed. "Oh well, in that case, He lifted up the chain which divided the up and down escalators. You'd better get back down, but don't let me catch you up to any tricks again. Thank you very much, said Paddington gratefully as he ducked under the chain. It's very kind of you, I'm sure. He turned to wave goodbye, but before he could raise his hat, he found himself being whisked into the depths of the underground again. Halfway down, he was gazing with interest at the brightly colored posters on the wall, when the man standing behind poked him with this umbrella. There's someone calling you, he said. Paddington looked round and was just in time to see Mrs. Bird and Judy pass by on their way up. They waved frantically at him, and Mrs. Brown called out "Stop" several times. Paddington turned and tried to run up the escalator, but it was going very fast, and with his short legs it was as much as he could to even stand still. He had his head down, and he didn't notice a fat man with a briefcase who was running in the opposite direction until it was too late. There was a roar of rage from the fat man, and the toppled over the grabbed at several other people. Then Paddington felt himself falling. He went bump, bump, bump all the way down before he shot off the end and finally skipped to a stop by the whale. When he looked around, everything seemed very confused. The number of people were gathered around the fat man, who was sitting on the floor rubbing his head. Away in the distance he could see Mrs. Brown and Judy trying to push their way down the up escalator. It was while he was watching their effort that he saw another notice. It was in a brass case at the bottom of the escalator, and it said in big red letters, "To stop the escalator in cases of emergency, push the button." It also said in much smaller letters, "Penalty for improper use £50. But in his hurry, Paddington did not notice this. In any case, it seemed to him very much of an emergency. He swung his suitcase through the air and hit the button as hard as he could. If there had been confusion while the escalator was moving, there was even more when it stopped. Paddington watched with surprise as everyone started running about in different directions, shouting at each other. One man even began calling out "Fire!" and somewhere in the distance a bell began to ring. He was just thinking what a lot of excitement pressing a small button could cause when a heavy hand descended on his shoulder. "That's him," someone shouted, pointing an accusing finger. "Saw him do it with my own eyes, as large as life." "Hit it with his case," shouted another voice. "Ought not to be allowed." While from the back of the crowd someone else suggested sending for the police. Paddington began to feel frightened, but turned and looked up at the owner of the hand. "Oh," said the stern voice, "it's you again. I might have known." The inspector took out a notebook. "Name, please." Paddington," said Paddington. "I said, what's your name? Not where do you want to go?" repeated the inspector. "That's right," said Paddington. "That is my name." "Paddington," said the inspector unbelievingly. "It can't be. That's the name of the station. I've never heard a bear called Paddington before." "It's very unusual," said Paddington. "But it's Paddington Brown, and I live at number 32 Windsor Gardens. And I've lost Mrs. Brown and Judy. Oh, the inspector wrote something in his book. Can I see your ticket? I had it, said Paddington, but I don't seem to anymore. The inspector began writing again, playing on the escalator, traveling without a ticket, stopping the escalator. All serious offenses they are. He looked up. What have you got to say to that, young fellow, my lad? Well, Paddington shifted uneasily and looked down at his pulse. Have you tried looking inside your head? Asked the inspector, not kindly. People often put their tickets in there. Paddington jumped with relief. I knew I had it somewhere, he said thankfully as he handed it to the inspector. The inspector handed it back again quickly. The inside of Paddington's hat was rather sticky. I've never known anyone take so long not to get anywhere, he said, looking hard at Paddington. Do you often travel on the underground? It's the first time, said Paddington. And the last, if you have anything to do with it, said Mrs. Brown as she pushed her way through the crowd. Is this your bear, madam? Asked the inspector. Because if it is, I have to inform you that he's in serious trouble. He began to read from his notebook. As far as I can see, he's broken 2 important regulations. Probably more. I shall have to give him into custody. Oh dear, Mrs. Brown clutched at Judy for support. Do you have to? He's only small, and it's his first time out in London. I'm sure he won't do it again. Ignorance of the law is no excuse, said the inspector ominously. Not in court. Persons are expected to abide by the regulations. It says so. In court, Mrs. Brown passed the hand nervously over her forehead. The word court always upset her. She had visions of Paddington being taken away in handcuffs and being cross-examined and all sorts of awful things. Judy took hold of Paddington's paw and squeezed it reassuringly. Paddington looked up gratefully. He wasn't at all sure what they were talking about, but none of it sounded very nice. Did you say persons are expected to abide by the regulations? Judy asked firmly. That's right, began the inspector. And I have my duty to do the same as everyone else. But it doesn't say anything about bears, asked Judy innocently. Well, the inspector scratched his head. Not in so many words. He looked down at Judy, then at Paddington, and then all around. The escalator had started up again, and the crowd of sightseers had disappeared. It's all highly irregular, he said. But, oh, thank you, said Judy. I think you're the kindest man I ever met. Don't you think so, Paddington? Paddington nodded his head vigorously, and the inspector blushed. I shall always travel on this underground in future, said Paddington politely. I'm sure it's the nicest in all London. The inspector opened his mouth and seemed about to say something, but he closed it again. Come along, children, said Mrs. Bird hastily. If we don't hurry up, we shall never get our shopping done. From somewhere up above came the sound of dogs barking. The inspector sighed. I can't understand it, he said. This used to be such a well-run, respectable station. Now look at it. He stared after retreating figures, of Mrs. Brown and Judy with Paddington, bringing up the rear, and then he rubbed his eyes. "That's funny," he said more to himself. "I must be seeing things. I could have sworn that bear had some bacon sticking after his case." He shrugged his shoulders. There were more important things to worry about. Judging by the noise coming from the top of the escalator, there was some sort of dog fight going on. It needed investigating. Chapter 4. A Shopping Expedition. A man in the gentleman's outfitting department at Bark Bridge held Paddington's hat an arm's length between thumb and forefinger. He looked at it distastefully. "I take it the young gentleman will not be requiring this any more, madam," he said. "Oh yes, I shall," said Paddington firmly. "I've always had the hat ever since I was small." "But wouldn't you like a nice new one, Paddington?" said Mrs. Brown hastily, for best. Paddington thought for a moment. "I will have one for worst if you like," he said. "That's my best one." The salesman shuddered slightly and, averting his gaze, placed the offending article on the far end of the counter. "Albert," he beckoned to a youth who was hovering in the background. "See what we have in size 4/7/8." Albert began to rummage under the counter. "And now, while we're about it," said Mrs. Brown, "we'd like a nice warm coat for the winter. Something like a duffel coat with toggles so that he can do it up easily, I thought. And we'd also like a plastic raincoat for the summer." The salesman looked at her hotly. He wasn't very fond of bears, and this one especially had been giving him queer looks ever since he'd mentioned his wretched hat. "Has Madam tried the bargain basement?" he began. "Something in government surplus." "No, I haven't," said Mrs. Brown heartily. "Government surplus, indeed. I've never heard of such a thing. Have you, Paddington?" "No," said Paddington, who had no idea what government surplus was. "Never." He stared hard at the man, who looked away uneasily. Paddington had a very persistent stare when he cared to use it. It was a very powerful stare, one which his Aunt Lucy had taught him and which he kept for special occasions. Mrs. Brown pointed to a smart blue duffel coat with a red lining. "That looks the very thing," she said. The assistant gulped. "Yes, madam, certainly, madam." He beckoned to Paddington. "Come this way, sir." Paddington followed the assistant, keeping about 2 feet behind him and staring very hard. The back of the man's neck seemed to go a dull red, and he fingered his collar nervously. As they passed the hat counter, Albert, who lived in a constant fear of his superior, and who had been watching the event with an open mouth, gave Paddington the thumb-up sign. Paddington waved a paw. He was beginning to enjoy himself. He allowed the assistant to help him on with the coat, and then stood admiring himself in the mirror. It was the first coat he had ever possessed. In Peru, It had been very hot, and though his Aunt Lucy had made him wear a hat to prevent sunstroke, it had always been much too warm for a coat of any sort. He looked at himself in the mirror and was surprised to see no one but a long line of bears stretching away as far as the eye could see. In fact, everywhere he looked there were bears, and they were all looking extremely smart. "Isn't the hood a trifle large?" asked Mrs. Brown anxiously. "Hoods are being worn large this year, madam," said the assistant. "It's the latest fashion." He was bought to as that Paddington seemed to have a rather a large hat anyway, but he changed his mind. Bears were rather unpredictable. You never quite knew what they were thinking, and this one in particular seems to have a mind of his own. "Do you like it, Paddington?" asked Mrs. Brown. Paddington gave up counting bears in the mirror and turned around to look at the back view. "I think it's the nicest coat I ever seen," he said, after a moment's thought. Mrs. Brown and the assistants heaved a sigh of relief. "Good," said Mrs. Brown. "That's settled then. Now there's just a question of a hat and a plastic mackintosh." She walked over to the hat counter, where Albert, who could still hardly take these admiring eyes of Paddington, had arranged a huge pile of hats. There were bowler hats, sun hats, tree hats, berry, and even a very small top hat. Mrs. Brown eyed them doubtfully. "It's difficult," she said, looking at Paddington. "It's largely a question of his ears. You could cut some holes for them," said Albert. The assistant froze him with a glance. "Cut a hole in a Bark Ridge's hat!" he exclaimed. "I've never heard of such a thing." Paddington turned and stared at him. The assistant's voice trailed off. "I will go and fetch my scissors," he said in a quiet voice. "I don't think that will be necessary at all," said Mrs. Brown hurriedly. "It's not as if he had to go to work in the city, so he doesn't want anything too smart. I think this woolen beret is very nice. The one with the pom-pom on top. The green will go well with his new coat, and it is stretched so that he can pull it down over his ears when it gets cold." Everyone agreed that Paddington looked very smart, and while Mrs. Brown looked for a plastic mackintosh, he trotted off to have another look at himself in the mirror. He found the beret was a little difficult to raise, as his ears kept the bottom half firmly in place. But by pulling on the pom-pom he could make it stretch quite a long way, which was almost as good. It meant, too, that he could be polite without getting his ears cold. The assistants wanted to wrap up the duffel coat for him, but after a lot of fuss, it was agreed that even though it was a warm day, he should wear it. Paddington felt very proud of himself, and he was anxious to see if other people noticed. After shaking hands with Albert, Paddington gave the assistants one more long, hard stare, and the unfortunate man collapsed into a chair and began mopping his brow as Mrs. Brown led the way out through the door. Bark Ridge's was a large shop, and it even had its own escalator as well as several lifts. Mrs. Brown hesitated at the door and then took Paddington's paw firmly in her hand and led him toward the lift. She'd had enough of escalator for one day. But to Paddington everything was new, or almost everything. and he liked trying strange things. After a few seconds, he decided quite definitely that he preferred riding on an escalator. They were nice and smooth, but lift. To start with, it was full of people carrying parcels, and was so busy they had no time to notice a small bear. One woman even rested her shopping bag on his head and seemed quite surprised when Paddington pushed it off. That suddenly half of him seemed to fall away, while the other half stayed where it was. Just as he had got used to that feeling, the second half of him caught up again, and even overtook the first half before the doors opened. It did that 4 times on the way down, and Paddington was glad when the man in charge said it was the ground floor and the Mrs. Brown led him out. She looked at him closely. "Oh dear, Paddington, you look quite pale," she said. "Are you all right?" "I feel sick," said Paddington. "I don't like lifts, and I wish I hadn't had such a big breakfast." "Oh dear," Mrs. Brown looked around. Judy, who had gone off to do some shopping on her own, was nowhere to be seen. "Will you be all right sitting here for a few minutes while I go off to find Judy?" she asked. Paddington sank down onto his case, looking very mournful. Even the pom-pom his hat seemed limp. "I don't know whether I shall be all right," he said, "but I will do my best." "It will be as quick as I can," said Mrs. Brown. "Then we can take a taxi home for lunch." Paddington groaned. "Poor Paddington," said Mrs. Brown. "You must be feeling bad if you don't want any lunch." At the word lunch again, Paddington closed his eyes and gave an even louder groan. Mrs. Brown tiptoed away. Paddington kept his eyes closed for several minutes, and then he began to feel better. He gradually became aware that every now and then a nice cool draught of air blew over his face. He opened one eye carefully to see where it was coming from, and noticed for the first time that he was sitting near the main entrance to the shop. He opened his other eye and decided to investigate. If he stayed just outside the glass door, he could still see Mrs. Brown and Judy where they came. And then as he bent down to pick up his suitcase, everything suddenly went black. "Oh dear," thought Paddington, "now all the lights have gone out." He began groping his way with outstretched paws towards the door. He gave a push where he thought it ought to be, but nothing happened. He tried moving along the wall a little way, and gave another push. This time it did move. The door seemed to have a strong spring on it, and he had to push hard to make it open. But eventually there was a gap big enough for him to squeeze through. It clanged shut behind him, and Paddington was disappointed to find it was just as dark outside as it had been in the shop. He began to wish he'd stayed where he was. He turned around and tried to find the door, but it seemed to have disappeared. He decided it might be easier if he got down on his paws and crawled. He went a little way like this, and then his head came up against something hard. He tried to push it to one side with his paw, and it moved slightly, so he pushed it again. Suddenly, there was a noise like thunder, and before he knew where he was, a whole mountain of things began to fall on him. It felt as if the whole sky had fallen in. Everything went quiet, and he lay where he was for a few minutes with his eye tightly shut, hardly daring to breathe. From a long way away he could hear voices. From a long way away he could hear voices, and once or twice it sounded as if someone was banging on a window. He opened one eye carefully and was surprised to find the light had come on again. At least, sheepishly he pushed the hood of his duffel coat up over his head. His hood must have fallen over his head when he bent down inside the shop to pick up his case. Paddington sat up and looked around to see where he was. He felt much better now. Somewhat to his astonishment, he found he was sitting in a small room in the middle of which was a great pile of tins and basins and bowls. He rubbed his eyes and stared round-eyed at the sight. Behind him there was a wall with a door in it, and in front of him there was a large window. On the other side of the window, there was a large crowd of people, pushing one another and pointing in his direction. Paddington decided with pressure that they must be pointing at him. He stood up with difficulty, because it was hard standing up straight on top of the lot of tins, and put the pom-pom on his hat as high as it would go. A cheer went up from the crowd. Paddington gave a bow, waved several times, and then started to examine the damage all around him. For a moment he wasn't quite sure where it was, and then it came to him. Instead of going out into the street, he must have opened the door leading to one of the shop windows. Paddington was an observant bear, and since he had arrived in London, he'd noticed lots of these shop windows. They were very interesting. They always had so many things inside them to look at. Once he'd seen a man working in one, piling tin cans and boxes on top of each other to make a pyramid. He remembered deciding at the time what a nice job it must be. He looked round thoughtfully. "Oh dear," he said to the world in general, "I'm in trouble again." If he'd knocked all these things down, as he supposed he must have done, someone was going to be cross. In fact, lots of people were going to be cross. People weren't very good at having things explained to them, and it was going to be difficult explaining how his duffel coat hood had fallen over his head. He bent down and began to pick up the things. There were some glass shelves lying on the floor where they had fallen. It was getting warm inside the window, so he took off his duffel coat and hung it carefully on a nail. Then he picked up a glass shelf and tried balancing it on top of some tins. It seemed to work, so he put some more tins and a washing up bowls on top of that. It was rather wobbly, but he stood back and examined it. Yes, it looked quite nice. There was an encouraging round of applause from outside. Paddington waved a paw at the crowd and picked up another shelf. Inside the shop, Mrs. Brown was having an earnest conversation with the store detective. "You say you left him here, madam," the detective was saying. "That's right," said Mrs. Brown. "He was feeling ill, and I told him not to go away. His name's Paddington." Paddington. The detective wrote it carefully in his notebook. "What sort of a bear is he?" "Oh, he's sort of golden," said Mrs. Brown. "He was wearing a blue duffel coat and carrying a suitcase." "And he has black ears," said Judy. "You can't mistake him." "Black ears. the detective repeated, licking his pencil. I don't expect that it helped much, said Mrs. Brown. He was wearing his beret. The detective cupped his hand over his ear. His what? He shouted. There really was a terrible noise coming from somewhere. It seemed to be getting worse every minute. Every now and then, there was a round of applause of several times. He distinctly heard the sound of people cheering. His beret, shouted Mrs. Brown in return. A green wooden one that came down over his ears with a pom-pom. The detective shut his notebook with a snap. The noise outside was definitely getting worse. Pardon me, he said sternly. There was something strange going on that needs investigating. Mrs. Brown and Judy exchanged glances. The same thought was running through both their minds. They both said Paddington and rushed after the detective. Mrs. Brown clung to the detective's coat, and Judy clung to Mrs. Brown's as they forced their way through the crowd on the pavement. Just as they reached the window, a tremendous cheer went up. I might have known, said Mrs. Brown. Paddington, exclaimed Judy. Paddington had just reached the top of his pyramid. At least it had started off to be a pyramid, but it wasn't really. It wasn't any particular shape at all, and it was very recurring. Having placed the last tin on the top, Paddington was in trouble. He wanted to get down, but he couldn't. He reached out the paw, and the mountain began to wobble. Paddington clung helplessly to the tins, swaying to the fro, watched by a fascinated audience. And then, without any warning, the whole lot collapsed again. Only this time, Paddington was on top and not underneath. A groan of disappointment went up from the crowd. Best thing I ever seen in years, said a man in the crowd to Mrs. Brown. Blessed if I know how they think these things up. Will he do it again, Mommy? Asked the small boy. I don't think so, dear, said his mother. I think he's finished for the day. She pointed to the window, where the detective was removing a sorry-looking Paddington. Mrs. Brown hurried back to the entrance, followed by Judy. Inside the shop, the detective looked at Paddington, and then at his notebook. Blue duffel coat, he said, green wool beret. He pulled the beret off. Bird ears, I know who you are, he said grimly. You are Paddington. Paddington really felt bewildered with astonishment. However did you know that, he said. I'm a detective, said the man. It's my job to know these things. We are always on the outlook for criminals. But I'm not a criminal, said Paddington heartily. I'm a bear. Besides, I was only tidying up the window. Tidying up the window? The detective spluttered. I don't know what Mr. Pankins will have to say. He only dressed it this morning. Paddington looked around uneasily. He could see Mrs. Brown and Judy hurrying towards him. In fact, there were several people coming his way, including an important-looking man in a black coat and striped trousers. They all reached him at the same time, and all began talking together. Paddington sat down on his case and watched them. There were times when it was much better to keep quiet, but this was one of them. In the end, it was the important-looking man who won, because he had the loudest voice and kept on talking when everyone else had finished. To Paddington's surprise, he reached it down, took hold of his paw, and started to shake it so hard he thought it was going to drop off. "Delighted to know you, Bear," he boomed. "Delighted to know you, and congratulations." "That's all right," said Paddington thoughtfully. He didn't know why, but the man seemed very pleased. The man turned to Mrs. Brown. "You say his name Paddington?" "That's right," said Mrs. Brown. "And I'm sure he didn't mean any harm." "Harm?" The man looked at Mrs. Brown in amazement. "Did you say harm, my dear lady? Through the action of this bear, we've had the biggest crowd in years. Our telephone hasn't stopped ringing." He waved towards the entrance to the store. "And still they come." He placed his hand on Paddington's head. "Barkridge," he said. "Barkridge is grateful." He waved his other hand for silence. "We would like to show our gratitude if there is anything in the store you would like." Paddington's eyes gleamed. He knew just what he wanted. He'd seen it on their way up to the outfitting department. It had been standing all by itself on a counter in the food store. The biggest one he'd ever seen, almost as big as himself. "Please," he said, "I'd like one of those jars of marmalade, one of the big ones." If the manager of Barkridge felt surprised, he didn't show it. He stood respectfully to the side, by the entrance to the lift. "Marmalade it shall be," he said, pressing the button. "I think," said Paddington, "if you don't mind, I'd rather use the stairs." Chapter 5, Paddington and the Old Master. Paddington soon settled down and became one of the family. In fact, in no time at all, it was difficult to imagine what life had been like without him. He made himself useful about the house, and the days passed quickly. The Browns lived near the Portobello Road, where there was a big market, and quite often, when Mrs. Brown was busy, she let him go out to do the shopping for her. Mr. Brown made a shopping trolley for him, an old basket on wheels with a handle for steering it. Paddington was a good shopper, and soon became well known to all the traders in the market. He was very thorough and took the job of shopping seriously. He would press the fruit to see that it had the right degree of firmness, as Mrs. Bird had shown him, and he was always on the lookout for bargains. He was a popular bear with the traders, and most of them went out of their way to save the best thing of the day for him. "That bear gets more for his 10 pence than anyone I know," said Mrs. Bird. "I don't know how he gets away with it, really I don't know. It must be the mean streak in him." "I'm not mean," said Paddington indignantly. "I'm just careful, that's all." "Whatever it is," replied Mrs. Bird, "you're worth your weight in gold." Paddington took his remark very seriously, and spent a long time weighing himself on the bathroom scales. Eventually, he decided to consult his friend, Mr. Gruber, on the subject. Now, Paddington spent a lot of time looking in shop windows, and of all the windows in the Portobello Road, Mr. Gruber's was the best. For one thing, it was nice and low so that he could look in without having to stand on tiptoe. And for another, it was full of interesting things. All the pieces of furniture, medals, pots and pans, pictures. There were so many things it was difficult to get inside the shop. And old Mr. Gruber spent a lot of his time sitting in the deck chair on the pavement. Mr. Gruber, in his turn, found Paddington very interesting, and soon they had become great friends. Paddington often stopped there on his way home from the shopping expedition, and they spent many hours discussing South America, where Mr. Gruber had been when he was a boy. Mr. Gruber usually had a bun and a cup of cocoa in the morning for what he called his 11s, and he had taken so sharing it with Paddington. There's nothing like a nice chat over a bun and a cup of cocoa, he used to say, and Paddington, who liked all three, agreed with him, even though the cocoa didn't make his whiskers go a funny color. Paddington was always interested in bright things, and he had consulted Mr. Gruber one morning on the subject of his Peruvian centavos. He had an idea in the back of his mind that if they were worth a lot of money, he could perhaps sell them and buy a present for the Browns. The £1 a week pocket money Mr. Brown gave him was nice, but by the time he had bought some buns on a Saturday morning, there wasn't much left. After a great deal of consideration, Mr. Gruber had advised Paddington to keep the coins. It's not always the brightest thing that fetches the most money, Mr. Brown, he had said. Mr. Gruber always called Paddington Mr. Brown, and it made him feel very important. He had taken Paddington into the back of the shop where his desk was, and from a drawer he had taken a cardboard box full of old coins. They had been rather dirty and disappointing. "See these, Mr. Brown," he had said. "These are what they called sovereign. You wouldn't think they were very valuable to look at them, but they are. They are made of gold, and they are worth £50 each. That's more than £100 for an ounce. If you ever find any of those, just you bring them to me." One day, having weighed himself carefully on the scales, Paddington hurried around to Mr. Gruber, taking with him a piece of paper from his scrapbook covered with mysterious calculations. After a big meal on a Sunday, Paddington had discovered he weighed nearly 16 pounds. That was, he looked at his piece of paper again as he neared Mr. Gruber's shop. There was nearly 260 ounces, which meant he was worth nearly £26,000. Mr. Gruber listened carefully to all that Paddington had to tell him, and then closed his eyes and thought for a moment. He was a kindly man, and he didn't want to disappoint Paddington. "I've no doubt," he said at last, "that you're worth that. You're obviously a very valuable young bear. I know it. Mr. and Mrs. Brown know it. Mrs. Bird knows it. But to other people—" He looked at Paddington over his glasses. "Things aren't always what they seem in this world, Mr. Brown," he said sadly. Paddington sighed. It was very disappointing. "I wish they were," he said. It would be nice, perhaps, said Mr. Gruber mysteriously. Perhaps, but we shouldn't have any nice surprise then, should we? He took Paddington into his shop and after offering him a seat disappeared for a moment. When he returned, he was carrying a large picture of a boat. At least half of it was a boat. The other half seemed to be the picture of a lady in a large hat. There you are, he said proudly. That's what I mean by things not always being what they seem. I'd like your opinion on it, Mr. Brown. Paddington felt rather flattered but also puzzled. The picture didn't seem to be one thing or the other, and he said so. Oh, said Mr. Gruber delightedly. It isn't at the moment, but just you wait until I've cleaned it. I gave 50p for that picture years and years ago, when it was just a picture of a sailing ship. And what do you think? When I started to clean it the other day, all the paint began to come off, and I discovered there was another painting underneath. He looked around and then lowered his voice. Nobody else knows, he whispered. But I think the one underneath may be valuable. It may be what they called an old master. Seeing that Paddington still looked puzzled, he explained to him that in the old days, when artists ran short of money and couldn't afford any canvas to paint on, they sometimes painted on top of old pictures. And sometimes, very occasionally, they painted them on top of pictures by artists who afterwards became famous and whose pictures were worth a lot of money. But as they had been painted over, no one knew anything about them. It all sounds very complicated, said Paddington thoughtfully. Mr. Gruber talked for a long time about painting, which was one of his favorite subjects. But Paddington, though he was usually interested in anything Mr. Gruber had to tell him, was hardly listening, eventually refusing Mr. Gruber's offer a second cup of cocoa. He slipped down off the chair and began making his way home. He raised his head automatically whenever anyone said good day to him, but there was a faraway expression in his eyes. Even the smell of the buns from the bakery passed unheeded. Paddington had an idea. When he got home, he went upstairs to his room and lay on the bed for a long while staring up at the ceiling. He was up there so long that Mrs. Bird became quite worried and poked her head round the door to know if it was all right. Quite all right, thank you, said Paddington distinctly. I'm just thinking. Mrs. Bird closed the door and hurried downstairs to tell the others. Her news had a mixed reception. I don't mind him just thinking, said Mrs. Brown with a worried expression on her face. It's when he actually thinks of something that the trouble starts. But she was in the middle of her housework and soon forgot the matter. Certainly, both she and Mrs. Bird were much too busy to notice the small figure of a bear creeping cautiously in the direction of Mr. Brown's shed a few minutes later. Nor did they see him return armed with a bottle of Mr. Brown's paint remover and a large pile of rags. Had they done so, they might have had good cause to worry. And if Mrs. Brown had seen him creeping on tiptoe into the drawing room, closing the door carefully behind him, she wouldn't have had a minute's peace. Fortunately, everyone was much too busy to notice any of these things. Even more fortunately, no one came into the drawing room for quite a long while. Because Paddington was in a mess. Things hadn't gone at all according to plan. He was beginning to wish he had listened more carefully to the things Mr. Gruber had said on the subject of cleaning paintings. To start with, even though he'd used almost half a bottle of Mr. Brown's painting remover, the picture had only come off in patches. Secondly, and what was even worse, where it had come off there was nothing underneath. Only the white canvas. Paddington stood back and surveyed his handiwork. Originally, it had been a painting of the lake, with a blue sky and several sailing boats dotted around. Now it looked like a storm at sea. All the boats had gone, the sky was a funny shade of grey, and half the lake had disappeared. What a good thing I found this old box of paint, he thought as he stood back holding the end of the brush at palm's length, and squinting at it as he'd once seen a real artist do. Holding a palette in his left paw, he squeezed some red paint onto it, and then splattered it about with the brush. He looked nervously over his shoulder, and then dabbed some of it onto the canvas. Paddington had found the paints in a cupboard under the stairs. A whole box of them. There were red and green and yellow and blues. In fact, there were so many different colors, it was difficult to know which to choose first. He wiped the brush carefully on his hat, and tried another color and then another. It was all so interesting that he thought he would try a bit of each, and he very soon forgot the fact that he was supposed to be painting a picture. In fact, it was more of a design than a picture, with lines and circles and crosses in all different colors. Even Paddington was startled when he finally stepped back to examine it. Of the original picture, there was no trace at all. Rather sadly, he put the tubes of paint back into the box and wrapped the picture in a canvas bag, leaning against the wall, exactly as he'd found it. He decided reluctantly to have another try later on. Painting was fun while it lasted, but it was much more difficult than it looked. He was very silent all through dinner that evening. He was so silent that several times Mrs. Brown asked him how he was, until eventually Paddington asked to be excused and went upstairs. "I do hope he's all right, Henry," she said after he'd gone. "He hardly touched his dinner, and that's so unlike him. And he seemed to have some funny red spot all over his face." "Crikey," said Jonathan. "Red spot. I hope he's giving it to me, whatever it is. Then I shouldn't have to go back to school." "Well, he's got green ones as well," said Judy. "I saw some green ones." "Green ones?" Even Mr. Brown looked worried. "I wonder if he's sickening for anything. If they are not gone in the morning, I will send for the doctor." He was so looking forward to going to the handicraft exhibition too, said Mrs. Brown. "It'd be a shame if he has to stay in bed." "Do you think you will win a prize with your painting, Dad?" asked Jonathan. "No one will be more surprised than your father if he does," replied Mrs. Brown. "He's never won a prize yet." "What is it, Dad?" asked Judy. "Aren't you going to tell us?" "It meant to be a surprise," said Mr. Brown modestly. It took me a long time to do. It's painted from memory. Painting was one of Mr. Brown's hobbies, and once a year he entered a picture photo handicraft exhibition which was held in Kensington, near where they lived. Several famous people came to judge the pictures, and there were a number of prizes. There were also lots of other competitions, and it was a sore pain with Mr. Brown that he had never won anything, whereas twice Mr. Brown had won a prize in a rug-making competition. Anyway, he said, declaring the subject closed, "It's too late now. The man collected this afternoon, so we shall see what we shall see." The sun was shining the next day, and the exhibition was crowded. Everyone was pleased that Paddington looked so much better. His spots had completely disappeared, and he ate a large breakfast to make up for missing so much dinner the night before. Only Mrs. Bird had her suspicions when she found Paddington's spots on his towel in the bathroom, but she kept her thoughts to herself. The Browns occupied the middle 5 seats of the front row, where the judging was to take place. There was an air of great excitement. It was news to Paddington that Mr. Brown actually painted, and he was looking forward to seeing a picture by someone he knew. On the platform, several important-looking men with beards were bustling about, talking to each other and waving their arms in the air. They appeared to be having a great deal of argument about a painting in particular. "Henry," whispered Mrs. Brown excitedly, "I do believe they are talking about yours." I recognized the canvas bag. Mr. Brown looked puzzled. "It certainly looks like my bag," he said. "But I don't think it can be. All the canvas was stuck to the painting. Didn't you see, just as if someone had put it inside, while it was still wet? I painted mine ages ago." Paddington sat very still and stared straight ahead, hardly daring to move. He had a strange sinking feeling in the bottom of his stomach, as if something awful was about to happen. He began to wish he hadn't washed his spots off that morning. Then at least he could have stayed in bed. Judy poked him with her elbow. "What's the matter, Paddington?" she asked. "You look most peculiar. Are you all right?" "I don't feel ill," said Paddington in a small voice, "but I think I'm in trouble again." "Oh dear," said Judy. "Well, keep your paws crossed. This is it." Paddington sat up. One of the men on the platform, the most important-looking one with the biggest beard, was speaking, and there Paddington's knees began to tremble. There on the platform, on a easel, in full view of everyone, was his picture. He was so dazed he only caught scraps of what the man was saying. "Remarkable use of color. Very unusual. Great imagination. A credit to the artist." And then he almost fell off his seat with surprise. "The winner of the first prize is Mr. Henry Brown of 32 Windsor Gardens." Paddington wasn't the only one who felt surprised. Mr. Brown, who was being helped up onto the platform, looked as if he had just been struck by lightning. But, he stuttered. "There must be some mistake." "Mistake?" said the man with the beard. "Nonsense, my dear sir. Your name's on the back of the canvas. You are Mr. Brown, aren't you? Mr. Henry Brown. Mr. Brown looked at the painting with unbelieving eyes. "It's certainly my name on the back," he said. "It's my writing." He left the sentence unfinished and looked down towards the audience. He had his own idea on the subject, but it was difficult to catch Paddington's eye. It usually was when you particularly wanted to. "I think," said Mr. Brown, when the applause had died down, and he had accepted the cheque for £10, which the man gave him. "Pound as I am, I think I would like to donate the prize to a certain home for retired bears in South America." A murmur of surprise went round the assembly, but it passed over Paddington's head, though he would have been very pleased had he known its cause. He was staring hard at the painting, and in particular at the man with the large beard, who was beginning to look hot and bothered. "I think," said Paddington to the world in general, "they might have stood in the right way up. It's not every day a bear wins first prize in a painting competition." Chapter 6, A Visit to the Theatre. The Browns were all very excited. Mr. Brown had been given tickets for a box at the theatre. It was the first night of the brand new play, and the leading part was being played by the world-famous actor Sir Silly Bloom. Even Paddington became infected with the excitement. He made several journeys to his friend Mr. Gruber to have the theatre explained to him. Mr. Gruber thought he was very lucky to be going to the first night of a new play. "All sorts of famous people will be there," he said. "I don't suppose many bears have that sort of opportunity once in a lifetime." Mr. Gruber lent Paddington several second-hand books about the theatre. He was rather a slow reader, but there were lots of pictures, and in one of them, a big cut-out model of a stage which sprang up every time he opened the pages. Paddington decided that when he grew up he wanted to be an actor. He took to standing on his dressing table and striking poses in the mirror, just as he had seen them in the books. Mrs. Brown had her own thoughts on the subject. "I do hope it's a nice play," she said to Mrs. Bird. "You know what Paddington's like. He does take these things so seriously." "Oh well," said Mrs. Bird, "I shall sit at home and listen to the wireless in peace and quiet." "But it'll be an experience for him, and he does like experience so. Besides, he's been very good lately." "I know," said Mrs. Brown. "That's what worries me." As it turned out, the play itself was the least of Mrs. Brown's worries. Paddington was unusually silent all the way to the theatre. It was the first time he had been out after dark and the very first time he had seen the lights of London. Mr. Brown pointed out all the famous landmarks as they drove past in the car, and it was a gay party of Browns that eventually trooped into the theater. Paddington was pleased to find it all exactly as Mr. Gruber had described it to him, even down to the commissioner who opened the door for them and saluted as they entered the foyer. Paddington returned the salute with a wave of his paw and then sniffed. Everything was painted red and gold, and the theater had a nice, warm, friendly sort of smell. There was a slight upset at the cloakroom when he found he had to pay in order to leave his duffel coat and suitcase. The woman behind the counter turned quite nasty when Paddington asked for his things back. She was still talking about it in a loud voice as the attendant led them along a passage toward their seats. At the entrance to the box, the attendant paused. "Program, sir," she said to Paddington. "Yes, please," said Paddington, taking 5. "And would you like coffee in the interval, sir?" she asked. Paddington's eyes glistened. "Oh yes, please," he said, imagining it was a kind thought on the part of the theater. He tried to push his way past, but the attendant barred the way. "That'll be £7.50, she said. £1 each for the programs, and £50 each for the coffee." Paddington looked as if he could hardly believe his ears. £7.50, he repeated. £7.50. "That's all right, Paddington," said Mr. Brown, anxious to avoid another fuss. "It's my treat. You go in and sit down." Paddington obeyed like a shot, but he gave the attendant some very queer looks while she arranged some cushions for his seat in the front row. All the same, he was pleased to see he had given him the one nearest the stage. He'd already sent a postcard to his Aunt Lucy with a carefully drawn copy of a plan of the theater, which he'd found in one of Mr. Gruber's books, and a small cross in one corner marked my seat. The theater was quite full, and Paddington waved to the people down below. Much to Mrs. Brown's embarrassment, several of them pointed and waved back. "I do wish he wouldn't be quite so friendly," she whispered to Mr. Brown. "Wouldn't you like to take off your duff coat now?" asked Mr. Brown. "It'll be cold when you go out again." Paddington climbed up and stood on his chair. "I think perhaps I will," he said. "It's getting warm." Judy started to help him off with it. "Mind my marmalade sandwich," cried Paddington, as she placed it on the ledge in front of him. But it was too late. He looked around guiltily. "Crikey," said Jonathan. "It's falling on someone's head." He looked over the edge of the box. "It's the man with the bald head. He looks jolly cross." "Oh, Paddington." Mrs. Brown looked despairingly at him. "Do you have to bring marmalade sandwich to the theater?" "It's all right," said Paddington cheerfully. "I've some more in the other pocket, if anyone wants one. They are a bit squishy, I'm afraid, because I sat on them in the car." "There seems to be some sort of a row going on down below," said Mr. Brown, craning his head to look over the edge. "Some chap just waved his fist at him." And what's all this about marmalade sandwich? Mr. Brown was a bit slow on the uptake sometimes. Nothing there, said Mrs. Bird hastily. She decided to let the matter drop. It was much easier in the long run. In any case, Paddington was having a great struggle with himself over some opera glasses. He had just seen a little box in front of him marked opera glasses, 20 pence. Eventually, after a great deal of thought, he unlocked his suitcase and from a secret compartment withdrew 20 pence. I don't think much of this, he said a moment later, looking through them at the audience. Everyone looks smaller. You've got them the wrong way round, silly, said Jonathan. Well, I still don't think much of them, said Paddington, turning them round. I wouldn't have bought them if I'd known. Still, he added after a moment's thought, they might come in useful next time. As he began to speak, the overture came to an end and the curtain rose. The scene was the living room of a large house, and Sir Silly Bloom, in the part of the village square, was pacing up and down. There was a round of applause from the audience. You don't take them home, whispered Judy. You have to put them back when you leave. What? Cried Paddington in a loud voice. Several calls of a hush came from the darkened theatre as Sir Silly Bloom paused and looked pointedly in the direction of the bronze box. Do you mean to say, words failed Paddington for the moment. 20 pence, he said bitterly. That's 2 pounds worth. He turned his gaze on Sir Silly Bloom. Sir Silly Bloom looked rather irritable. He didn't like first night, and this one in particular had started badly. He had a nasty feeling about it. He much preferred playing the hero, where he had the sympathy of the audience, and in this play he was the villain. Being the first night of the play, he wasn't at all sure of some of his lines. To make matters worse, he had arrived at the theatre only to discover that the prompt boy was missing, and there was no one else to take his place. Then there was the disturbance in the stalls just before the curtain went up. Something to do with a marmalade sandwich. So the stage manager had said. Of course, that was all nonsense, but still, it was very disturbing. And then there was this noise crowd in the box. He sighed to himself. It was obviously going to be one of those nights. But if Sir Silly Bloom's hurt was not in the play, Paddington certainly was. He soon forgot about his wasted 20 pence and devoted all his attention to the plot. He decided quite early on that he didn't like Sir Silly Bloom, and he stared at him hard through his opera glasses. He followed his every move, and when, at the end of the first act, Sir Silly, in the part of the hard-hearted father, turned his daughter out into the world without a penny, Paddington stood up on his chair and waved his program indignantly at the stage. Paddington was a surprising bear in many ways, and he had a strong sense of right and wrong. As the curtain came down, he placed his opera glasses firmly on the ledge and climbed off his seat. Are you enjoying Paddington? Asked Mr. Brown. It's very interesting, said Paddington. He had a determined note to his voice, and Mrs. Brown looked at him sharply. He was beginning to recognize that tone, and it worried her. Where are you going, dear? She asked as he made for the door of the box. Oh, just for a walk, said Paddington vaguely. Well, don't be too long, she called as the door closed behind him. You don't want to miss any of the second act. Oh, don't fuss, Mary, said Mr. Brown. I expect he just wants to stretch his leg or something. He's probably gone out to the clock room. But at the moment Paddington was going, not in the direction of the clock room, but towards a door leading at the back of the theater. It was marked private, artists only. As he pushed the door open and passed through, he immediately found himself in an entirely different world. There were no red plush seats. Everything was very bare. Lots of ropes hung down from the roof. Pieces of scenery were stacked against the walls, and everyone seemed in a great hurry. Normally, Paddington would have been most interested in everything, but now he had a purposeful look on his face. Seeing a man bending over some scenery, he walked over and tapped him on the shoulder. Excuse me, he said. Can you tell me where the man is? The scene hand went on working. Man, he said. What man? The man, said Paddington patiently. The nasty man. Oh, you mean Sir Silly? The scene hand pointed towards a long corridor. He's in his dressing room. You'd better not go disturbing him, 'cause he's not in a very good mood. He looked up. Hey, he cried. You're not supposed to be in here. Who let you in? Paddington was too far away to answer, even if he had heard. He was already halfway up the corridor, looking closely at the old doors. Eventually, he came to one with a large star on it, and the word Cecily Bloom in big gold letters. Paddington drew a deep breath and then knocked loudly. There was no reply, so he knocked again. Still, there was no reply. And so, very cautiously, he pushed open the door with his paw. Go away, said a booming voice. I don't want to see anyone. Paddington peered round the door. Cecily Bloom was lying stretched out on a long couch. He looked tired and cross. He opened one eye and gazed at Paddington. I'm not signing any autographs, he growled. I don't want your autograph, said Paddington, fixing him with a hard stare. I wouldn't want your autograph if I had my autograph book. And I haven't got my autograph book, so there. Sir Silly sat up. You don't want my autograph, he said in a surprised voice. But everyone always wants my autograph. Well, I don't, said Paddington. I've come to tell you to take your daughter back. He gulped the last few words. The great man seemed to have grown to about twice the size he had been on the stage, and he looked as if he was going to explode at any minute. Sir Silly clutched his forehead. You want me to take my daughter back? He said at last. That's right, said Paddington firmly. And if you don't, I expect she can come and stay with Mr. and Mrs. Brown. Cecily Bloom ran his hand distractedly through his hair, and then pinched himself. Mr. and Mrs. Brown, he repeated in a dazed voice. He looked wildly round the room and then dashed to the door. Sarah, he called in a loud voice. Sarah, come in here at once. He backed round the room until he had placed the couch between himself and Paddington. Keep away, Bear, he said dramatically, and then peered at Paddington. For he was rather short-sighted. You are a bear, aren't you? He added. That's right, said Paddington, from darkest Peru. Cecily looked at his woolen hat. Well then, he said closely, playing for time. You ought to know better than you wear a green hat in my dressing room. Don't you know green is a very unlucky color in the theater? Take it off at once. It's not my fault, said Paddington. I wanted to wear my proper hat. He had just started to explain all about his hat when the door burst open and the lady called Sarah entered. Paddington immediately recognized her as Cecily's daughter in the play. It's all right, he said. I've come to rescue you. You've what? Our lady seemed most surprised. Sarah, Cecily Bloom, came out from behind the couch. Sarah, protect me from this mad bear. I'm not mad, said Paddington indignantly. Then kindly explain what you're doing in my dressing room, boomed the great actor. Paddington sighed. Sometimes people were very slow to understand things. Patiently, he explained it all to them. When he had finished, the lady called Sarah, threw back her head, and left. I'm glad you think it's funny, said Cecily. But, darling, don't you see, she said, it's a great compliment. Paddington really believes you are throwing me out into the world without a penny. It shows what a great actor you are. Cecily thought for a moment. Hump, he said gruffly. Quite an understandable mistake, I suppose. He looks a remarkably intelligent bear, come to think of it. Paddington looked from one to the other. Then you were only acting all the time, he faltered. The lady bent down and took his paw. Of course, darling, but it was very kind of you to come to my rescue. I shall always remember it. Well, I would have rescued you if you'd wanted it, said Paddington. Cecily coughed. Are you interested in the theater, Bear? He boomed. Oh yes, said Paddington, very much, except I don't like having to pay so much for everything. I want to be an actor when I grow up. The lady called Sarah jumped up. Why, silly darling, she said, looking at Paddington. I've an idea. She whispered in Cecily's ear, and then Cecily looked at Paddington. It's a bit unusual, he said thoughtfully, but it's worth a try. Yes, it's certainly worth a try. In the theater itself, the interval was almost at an end, and the Browns were getting restless. Oh dear, said Mrs. Brown, I wonder where he's got to. If he doesn't hurry up, said Mr. Brown, he's going to miss the start of the second act. Just then there was a knock at the door, and an attendant handed him a note. A young bear gentleman asked me to give you this, he announced. He said it was very urgent. Thank you, said Mr. Brown, taking the note and opening it. What does it say? Asked Mrs. Brown anxiously. Is it all right? Mr. Brown handed her a note to read. Your guess is as good as mine, he said. Mr. Brown looked at it. It was hastily written in pencil and it said, I have been given a very important job. Paddington, P.S. I will tell you about it later. Now what on earth can that mean? She said. Trust something unusual to happen to Paddington. I don't know, said Mr. Brown, settling back in his chair as the lights went down. But I'm not going to let it spoil the play. I hope the second half is better than the first, said Jonathan. I thought the first half was rotten. The man kept on forgetting his lines. The second half was much better than the first. From the moment Cecily strode onto the stage, the theatre was electrified. A great change had come over him. He no longer fumbled over his lines, and people who had coughed all through the first half now sat in their seat and hung on his every word. When the curtain finally came down on the end of the play, with Cecily's daughter returning to his arms, there was a great burst of applause. The curtain rose again, and the whole company bowed to the audience. Then it rose while Cecily and Sarah bowed, but still the cheering went on. Finally, Cecily stepped forward and raised his hand for quiet. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, thank you for your kind applause. We are indeed most grateful. But before you leave, I would like to introduce the youngest and the most important member of our company. A young bear who came to our rescue. The rest of Cecily's speech was drawn in a buzz of excitement as he stepped forward to the very front of the stage, where a small screen hid a hole in the board which was the prompt box. He took hold of one of Paddington's paws and pulled. Paddington's head appeared through the hole. In his other paw, he was grasping a copy of the script. Come along, Paddington, said Cecily. Come and take your bow. I can't, gasped Paddington. I think I'm stuck. And stuck he was. It took several stage hands, the fireman, and a lot of butter to remove him after the audience had gone. But he was far enough out to twist round and raise his hat to the cheering crowd before the curtain came down for the last time. Several nights later, anyone going into Paddington's room would have found him sitting up in bed with his scrapbook, a pair of scissors, and a pot of paste. He was busy pasting in a picture of Cecily Bloom, which the great man had signed. To Paddington, with grateful thanks. There was also a signed picture from the lady called Sarah, and one of his proudest possessions, a newspaper cutting about the play handed Paddington Saves the Day. Mr. Gerber had told him that the photographs were probably worth a bit of money, but after much thought he had decided not to part with them. In any case, Cecily Bloom had given him his 20 pence back and a pair of opera glasses. Chapter 7, Adventure at the Seaside. One morning, Mr. Brown tapped the barometer in the hall. "It looks as if it's going to be a nice day," he said. "How about a trip to the sea?" His remark was greeted with enthusiasm by the rest of the family, and in no time at all, the house was in an uproar. Mrs. Bird started to cut a huge pile of sandwiches, while Mr. Brown got the car ready. Jonathan and Judy searched for their bathing suits, and Paddington went up to his room to pack. An outing which involved Paddington was always rather a business, as he insisted on taking all his things with him. As time went by, he had acquired lots of things, as well as his suitcase. He now had a smart weekend grip with the initial PB inscribed on the side, and a paper carrier bag for the odds and ends. For the summer month, Mrs. Brown had brought him a sun hat. It was made of straw and very floppy. Paddington liked it, for by turning the brim up or down, he could make it different shapes, and it was really like having several hats in one. "When we get to Bright Sea," said Mrs. Brown, "we'll buy you a bucket and spade. Then you can make a sandcastle." "And you can go to the pier," said Jonathan eagerly. "They've some super machines on the pier. You'd better bring plenty of coins." "And we can go swimming," added Judy. "You can swim, can't you?" "Not really well, I'm afraid," replied Paddington. "You see, I've never been to the seaside before." "Never been to Seaside?" Everyone stopped what they were doing and stared at Paddington. "Never," said Paddington. They all agreed that it must be nice to be going to the seaside for the first time in one's life. Even Mrs. Bird began talking about the time she first went to Bright Sea, many years before. Paddington became very excited as they told him all about the wonderful things he was going to see. The car was crowded when they started off. Mrs. Bird, Judy, and Jonathan sat in the back. Mr. Brown drove, and Mrs. Brown and Paddington sat beside him. Paddington liked sitting in the front, especially when the window was open, so that he could poke his head out in the cool breeze. After a minor delay, when Paddington's hat blew off on the outskirts of London, they were soon on the open road. "Can you smell the sea yet, Paddington?" asked Mrs. Brown after a while. Paddington poked his head out and sniffed. "I can smell something," he said. "Well," said Mr. Brown, "keep on sniffing because we're almost there." And sure enough, they had reached the top of the hill and rounded a corner to go down the other side. There it was in the distance, glistened in the morning sun. Paddington's eyes opened wide. "Look at all the boats on the dirt," he cried, pointing in the direction of the beach with a paw. Everyone laughed. "That's not dirt," said Judy. "That's sand." By the time they had explained all about sand to Paddington, they were in Bright Sea itself, and driving along the front. Paddington looked at the sea rather doubtfully. The waves were much bigger than he had imagined. Not so big as the one he'd seen on his journey to England, but quite large enough for a small bear. Mr. Brown stopped the car by the shop on the esplanade and took out some money. I'd like to fit this bear out for a day at the seaside, he said to the lady behind the counter. Let's see now. We shall need a bucket and spade, a pair of sunglasses, one of those rubber tires. As he reeled off the list, the lady handed the articles to Paddington, who began to wish he had more than 2 paws. He had a rubber tire round his middle, which kept slipping down around his knees, a pair of sunglasses perched precariously on his nose, his straw hat, a bucket and spade in one hand, and his suitcase in the other. Photograph, sir. Paddington turned to see an untidy man with a camera looking at him. Only £1, sir. Result guaranteed. Money back if you're not satisfied. Paddington considered the matter for a moment. He didn't like the look of the man very much, but he had been saving hard for several weeks, and now had just over £3. It would be nice to have a picture of himself. Won't take a minute, sir, said the man, disappearing behind a black cloth at the back of the camera. Just watch the birdie. Paddington looked around. There was no bird in sight as far as he could see. He went round behind the man and tapped him. The photographer, who appeared to be looking for something, jumped and then emerged from under his cloth. How do you expect me to take your picture if you don't stand in front? He asked in an aggrieved voice. Now I will waste the plate, and he looked shiftily at Paddington. That will cost you £1. Paddington gave him a hard stare. You said there was a bird, he said. And there wasn't. I expect it flew away when it saw your face, said the man nastily. Now where's my £1? Paddington looked at him even harder for a moment. Perhaps the bird took it when it flew away, he said. Ha ha, cried another photographer, who had been watching the proceeding with interest. Fancy you being taken in by a bear, Charlie. Serves you right for trying to take photographs without a license. Now be off with you before I call a policeman. He watched while the other man gathered up his belongings and slouched off in the direction of the pier. Then he turned to Paddington. These people are a nuisance, he said. Taking away the living from honest folk. You did quite right not to pay him any money. And if you will allow me, I'd like to take a nice picture of you myself as a reward. The Brown family exchanged glances. I don't know, said Mrs. Brown. Paddington always seemed to fall on his feet. That's because he's a bear, said Mrs. Bird darkly. Bears always fall on their feet. She led the way onto the beach and carefully laid out the traveling rug on the sand behind a breakwater. This will be as good a spot as any, he said. Then we shall all know where to come back to, and no one will get lost. The tide is out, said Mr. Brown, so it will be nice and safe for bathing. He turned to Paddington. Are you going in, Paddington? He asked. Paddington looked at the sea. I might go for a paddle, he said. Well, hurry up, called Judy, and bring your bucket and spade. Then we can practice making sand castles. Gosh, Jonathan pointed a notice pinned on the wall behind them. Look, there's a sand cast competition. Whistle. First prize £10 for the biggest sand castle. Suppose we all join in and make one, said Judy. I bet the three of us together could make the biggest one you've ever seen. I don't think you're allowed to, said Mrs. Brown, reading the notice. It says here everyone has to make their own. Judy looked disappointed. Well, I shall have a go anyway. Come on, you two. Let's have a bathe first. Then we can start digging after lunch. She raced down the sand closely, followed by Jonathan and Paddington. At least, Jonathan followed, but Paddington only got a few yards before his light belt slipped down, and he went headlong in the sand. Paddington, do give me your suitcase, called Mrs. Brown. You can't take it in the sea with you. It will get wet and be ruined. Looking rather crestfallen, Paddington handed his things to Mrs. Brown for safekeeping, and then ran down the beach after the others. Judy and Jonathan were already a long way out when he got there, so he contented himself with sitting on the water's edge of the while, letting the waves swirl around him as they came in. It was a nice feeling, a bit cold at first, but he soon got warm. He decided the seaside was a nice place to be. He paddled out to where the water was deeper, and then lay back in his rubber tire, letting the waves carry him gently back to the shore. 10 pounds, supposing he won 10 whole pounds. He closed his eyes. In his mind he had a picture of a beautiful castle made of sand, like the one he'd once seen in a picture book, with battlements and towers and a moat. It was getting bigger and bigger, and everyone else on the beach had stopped to gather round and cheer. Several people said they had never seen such a big sand castle, and he woke with a start as he felt someone splashing water on him. Come on, Paddington, said Judy, lying there in the sun fast asleep. It's time for lunch, and we got lots of work to do afterwards. Paddington felt disappointed. It had been a nice sand castle in his dream. He was sure it would have won first prize. He rubbed his eyes and followed Judy and Jonathan up the beach to where Mrs. Bird had laid out the sandwiches, ham, egg, and cheese for everyone else, and special marmalade ones for Paddington, with ice cream and fruit salad to follow. I vote, said Mr. Brown, who had in mind an after-lunch nap for himself, that after we've eaten, you all go off in different directions and make your own sand castles. Then we will have our own private competition, as well as the official one. I will give £1 to the one with the biggest castle. All three thought this was a good idea. But don't you go too far away, called Mrs. Brown, as Jonathan, Judy, and Paddington set off. Remember, the tide is coming in. Her advice fell on deaf ears. They were all much too interested in sand castles. Paddington especially was gripping his bucket and spade in a very determined fashion. The beach was crowded, and he had to walk quite a long way before he found a deserted spot. First of all, he dug a big moat in a circle, leaving himself a drawbridge so that he could fetch and carry the sand for the castle itself. Then he set to work carrying bucket loads of sand to build the walls of the castle. He was an industrious bear, and even though he was hard work, and his legs and paws soon got tired, He persevered until he had a huge pile of sand in the middle of his circle. Then he set to work with his spade, smoothing out the walls and making the battlements. They were very good battlements, with holes for windows and slots for the archers to fire through. When he had finished, he struck his spade in one of the corner towers, placed his hat on the top of that, and then lay down inside next to his marmalade jar and closed his eyes. He felt tired, but very pleased with himself. With the gentle roar of the sea in his ears, he soon went fast asleep. "We've been all along the beach," said Jonathan, "and we can't see him anywhere." "He didn't even have his life belt with him," said Mrs. Brown anxiously. "Nothing, just a bucket and spade." The Browns were gathered in a worried group round the man from the life-saving hut. "He's been gone several hours," said Mr. Brown, "and the tide's been in over 2. The man looked serious. "And you say he can't swim?" he asked. "He doesn't even like having a bath much," said Judy. "So I'm sure he can't swim." "Here's his photograph," said Mrs. Bird. "He only had it taken this morning." She handed the man Paddington's picture, and then dabbed her eyes with the handkerchief. "I know something's happened to him. He wouldn't have missed his tea unless something was wrong." The man looked at the picture. "We could send out a description," he said dubiously. "But it's a job to see what he looks like by that. It's all hat and dark glasses." "Can't you launch a light boat?" asked Jonathan hopefully. "We could," said the man, "if we knew where to look. But he might be anywhere." "Oh dear," Mrs. Brown reached for her handkerchief as well. "I can't bear to think about it." "Something will turn up," said Mrs. Bird comfortingly. "He's got a good head on his shoulders." "Well," said the man, holding up a dripping straw hat, "you'd better have this, and in the meantime, we will see what we can do." There, Mary," Mr. Brown held his wife's arm. "Perhaps he just left it on the beach or something. It may have got picked up by the tide." He bent down to pick up the rest of Paddington's belongings. They seemed very small and lonely, lying there on their own. "Is Paddington's hat all right?" said Judy, examining it. "Look, it's got his mark inside." She turned the hat inside out and showed them the outline of the paw marked in black ink, and the words "My hat, Paddington." "I vote we all separate," said Jonathan, "and comb and beach. We will stand more chance that way." Mr. Brown looked dubious. "It's getting dark," he said. Mrs. Bird put down the traveling rug and folded her arms. "Well, I'm not going back until he's found," she said. "I couldn't go back to the empty house, not without Paddington." "No one's thinking of going back without him, Mrs. Bird," said Mr. Brown. He looked helplessly out to sea. "It's just—" "Perhaps he didn't get swept out to the sea," said the life-saving man helpfully. "Perhaps he's just gone on the pier or something. There seemed to be a big crowd heading that way. Must be something interesting going on." He called out to a man who was just passing. "What's going on at the pier, chum?" Without stopping, the man looked back over his shoulder and shouted. "Chap just crossed the Atlantic all by itself on a raft. Hundreds of days without food or water, so they said," he hurried on. The life-saving man looked disappointed. Another of these publicity stunts, he said. We get 'em every year. Mr. Brown looked thoughtful. I wonder, he said, looking in the direction of the pier. It would be just like him, said Mrs. Bird. It's the sort of thing that would happen to Paddington. It's got to be, cried Jonathan. It's got to be. They all looked at each other and then, picking up their belongings, joined the crowd hurrying in the direction of the pier. It took them a long time to force their way through the turnstile, for the news that something would happen on the pier had spread, and there was a great throng at the entrance. But eventually, after Mr. Brown had spoken to a policeman, a way was made for them, and they were escorted to a very end, where the paddle steamers normally tied up. A strange sight met their eyes. Paddington, who had just been pulled out of the water by a fisherman, was sitting on his upturned bucket, talking to some reporters. Several of them were taking photographs, while the rest fired questions at him. Have you come all the way from America? Asked one reporter. The Browns, hardly knowing whether to laugh or cry, waited eagerly for Paddington's reply. Well, no, said Paddington truthfully. After a moment's pause, not America, but I've come a long way. He waved a paw vaguely in the direction of the sea. I got caught by a tide, you know. And you sat in that bucket all the time? Asked another man, taking a picture. That's right, replied Paddington. And I used my spade as a paddle. It was lucky I had it with me. Did you live on plankton? queried another voice. Paddington looked puzzled. No, he said, marmalade. Mr. Brown pushed his way through the crowd. Paddington jumped up and looked rather guilty. Now then, said Mr. Brown, taking his paw, that's enough questions for today. This bear's been at sea for a long time, and is tired. In fact, he looked meaningfully at Paddington. He's been at sea all the afternoon. Is it still only Tuesday? Asked Paddington innocently. I thought it was much later than that. Tuesday, said Mr. Brown firmly, and we've been worried to death over you. Paddington picked up his bucket and spade and jar of marmalade. Well, he said, I bet not many bears have gone to the sea in a bucket all the same. It was dark when they drove along bright sea front of their way home. The promenade was festooned with colored lights, and even the fontaine in the gardens kept changing color. It all looked very pretty, but Paddington, who was lying in the back of the car wrapped in the blanket, was thinking on his sand castle. I bet mine was bigger than anyone else's, he said sleepily. Bet you mine was the biggest, said Jonathan. I think, said Mr. Brown hastily, you'd all better have a pound just to make sure. Perhaps we can come again another day, said Mrs. Brown. Then we can have another competition. How about that, Paddington? There was no reply from the back of the car. Sandcastles paddling his bucket across the harbor, and the sea air had proved too much for Paddington. He was fast asleep. Chapter 8. A Disappearing Trick. "Oh," said Paddington, "is it really for me?" He stared hungrily at the cake. It really was a wonderful cake. One of Mrs. Bird's best. It was covered with sugar icing, and it had a cream and marmalade filling. On top, there was one candle and the words to Paddington, "With best wishes for a happy birthday from everyone." It had been Mrs. Bird's idea to have a birthday party. Paddington had been with them for 2 months. No one, not even Paddington, knew quite how old he was, so they decided to start again and call him one. Paddington thought this was a good idea, especially when he was told that bears had 2 birthdays every year, one in the summer and one in the winter. "Just like the Queen," said Mrs. Bird, "so you ought to consider yourself very important." Paddington did. In fact, he went round to Mr. Gruber straight away and told him the good news. Mr. Gruber looked impressed and was pleased when Paddington invited him to the party. "It's not often anyone invites me out, Mr. Brown," he said. "I don't know when I went out last, and I shall look forward to it very much indeed." He didn't say any more at the time, but the next morning a van drew up outside the Browns' house and delivered a mysterious-looking parcel from all the shopkeepers in the Portobello market. "Aren't you a lucky bear?" exclaimed Mrs. Brown when they opened the parcel. And so what was inside? It was a nice new shopping basket on wheels, with a bell on the side that Paddington could ring to let people know he was coming. Paddington scratched his head. "It's a job to know what to do first," he said as he carefully placed the basket with the other presents. "I shall have a lot of thank you letters to write." "Perhaps you'd better leave them until tomorrow," said Mrs. Brown hastily. Whenever Paddington wrote any letters, he generally managed to get more ink on himself than on the paper, and he was looking so unusually smart, having had a bath the night before, and it seemed a pity to spoil it. Paddington looked disappointed. He liked writing letters. "Perhaps I can help Mrs. Bird in the kitchen," he said hopefully. "I'm glad to say," said Mrs. Bird as she emerged from the kitchen, "that I've just finished, but you can lick the spoon if you like." She had bitter memories of other occasions when Paddington had helped in the kitchen. "But not too much," she warned, "or you won't have room for this." It was then that Paddington saw his cake for the first time. His eyes, usually large and round, became so much larger and rounder that even Mrs. Bird blushed with pride. "Special occasions demand special things," she said, and hurried off in the direction of the dining room. Paddington spent the rest of the day being hurried from one part of the house to another, as preparations were made for his party. Mrs. Brown was being tidying up. Mrs. Bird was busy in the kitchen. Jonathan and Judy were busy with the decorations. Everyone had a job except Paddington. "I thought it was supposed to be my birthday," he grumbled as he was sent packing into the drawing room for the 5th time after upsetting a box of marbles over the kitchen floor. "So it is, dear," said a flustered Mrs. Brown, "but your time comes later." She was beginning to regret telling him that bears had two birthdays every year, for already he was worrying about when the next one was due. "Now just you watch out of the window for the postman," she said, lifting him up onto the window sill. But Paddington didn't seem very keen on this, or as she said, "Practice doing some of your conjuring tricks, ready for this evening." Among Paddington's many presents was a conjuring outfit from Mr. and Mrs. Brown. It was a very expensive one from Buckeridge. It had a special magic table, a large mystery box, which made the thing disappear if you followed the instruction properly, a magic wand, and several packs of cards. Paddington emptied them all over the floor and settled down in the middle to read the book of instructions. He sat there for a long time, studying the pictures and diagrams, and reading everything twice to make sure. Every now and then he absentmindedly dipped a paw into his marmalade pot, and then, remembering it was his birthday, and that there was a big tea to come, he reached up and stood the jar on the magic table before returning to his studies. The first chapter was called Spells. It showed how to wave the magic wand and the correct way to say abracadabra. Paddington stood up clutching the book in one paw and waved the wand several times through the air. He also tried saying abracadabra. He looked around. Nothing seemed to have changed, and he was just about to try again when his eyes nearly popped out of his head. The jar of marmalade, which he'd placed on the magic table only a few minutes before, had disappeared. He searched hurriedly through the book. There was nothing about making marmalade disappear. Worse still, there was nothing about making it come back again, either. Paddington decided it must be a very powerful spell to make a whole pot vanish into thin air. He was about to rush outside and tell the others when he thought better of it. It might be a good trick to do in the evening, especially if he could persuade Mrs. Bird to give him another jar. He went out into the kitchen and waved his wand a few times in Mrs. Bird's direction, just to make sure. "I will give you abracadabra," said Mrs. Bird, pushing him out again. "And be careful with that stick, or you have someone's eye out." Paddington returned to the drawing room and tried saying his spell backward. Nothing happened. So he started reading the next chapter of the instruction book, which was called The Mystery of Disappearing Egg. "I shouldn't have thought you needed any book to tell you that," said Mrs. Bird at lunchtime, as Paddington told them all about it. "The way you gobble your food is nobody's business." "Well," said Mr. Brown, "so long as you don't try sewing anyone in half this evening, I don't mind." "I was only joking," he added hurriedly, as Paddington turned an inquiring gaze on him. Nevertheless, as soon as lunch was over, Mr. Brown hurried down the garden and locked up his tools. With Paddington there was no sense in taking chances. As it happened, he had no cause to worry, for Paddington had far too many things on his mind, what with one thing and another. The whole family was there for tea, as well as Mr. Gruber. Several other people came along too, including the Browns' next-door neighbor, Mr. Curry. The last name was a most unwelcome visitor. Just because there was a free tea, said Mrs. Bird. I think it's disgusting taking them crumbs off a young bear's plate like that. He's not even been invited. He will have to look sleepy if he gets any crumbs off Paddington's plate, said Mr. Brown. All the same, it is a bit thick after all the things he'd said in the past, and not even bothering to wish him many happy returns. Mr. Curry had a reputation in the neighborhood for meanness, and for poking his nose into other people's business. He was also very bad-tempered, and was always complaining about the least little thing, which met with the disapproval. In the past, that had often included Paddington, which was why the Browns had not invited him to the party. Not even Mr. Curry had no cause to complain about the tea. From the huge birthday cake down to the last marmalade sandwich, everyone thought it was the best tea they had ever had. Paddington himself was so full he had great difficulty in mustering enough breath to blow out the candle. But at last he managed it without singeing his whiskers, and everyone, including Mr. Curry, applauded and wished him a happy birthday. And now, said Mr. Brown when the noise had died down, if you will all move your seats back, I think Paddington has a surprise for us. While everyone was busy moving their seats to one side of the room, Paddington disappeared into the drawing room and returned carrying his conjuring outfit. There was a short delay while he erected his magic table and adjusted the mystery box, but soon all was ready. The lights were turned off except for a standard lamp, and Paddington waved his wand for quiet. Ladies and gentlemen, he began. Consulting his instruction book, my next trick is impossible. But you haven't done one yet, grumbled Mr. Curry. Ignoring the remark, Paddington turned over the page. For this trick, he said, I shall require an egg. Oh dear, said Mrs. Bird, as she hurried out to the kitchen. I know something dreadful is going to happen. Paddington placed the egg in the center of his magic table and covered it with a handkerchief. He muttered abracadabra several times and then hit the handkerchief with his wand. Mr. and Mrs. Brown looked at each other. They were both thinking of their carpet. Hey presto, said Paddington, and put the handkerchief away. To everyone's surprise, the egg had completely disappeared. Of course, said Mr. Curry knowledgeably, above the applause. It's all done by sleight of paw, but very good though for a bear. Very good indeed. Now make it come back again. Feeling very pleased with himself, Paddington took his bow and then felt in the secret compartment behind the table. To his surprise, he found something much larger than an egg. In fact, it was a jar of marmalade. It was the one that had disappeared that very morning. He displayed it in his paw. The applause for this trick was even louder. Excellent, said Mr. Curry, slapping his knee. Making people think he was going to find an egg, and it was a jar of marmalade all the time. Very good indeed. Paddington turned over a page, and now he announced it, flushed with success. The disappearing trick. He took a bowl of Mrs. Brown's best flowers and placed them on the dining table alongside his mystery box. He wasn't very happy about this trick, as he hadn't had time to practice it, and he wasn't at all sure how his mystery box worked, or even where you put the flowers to make them disappear. He opened the door in the back of the box and then poked his head around the side. "I shouldn't be a minute," he said, and then disappeared from view again. The audience sat in silence. "Rather a slow trick, this one," said Mr. Curry after a while. "I hope he's all right," said Mrs. Brown. "He seemed very quiet." "Well, he can't have gone far," said Mr. Curry. "Let's try knocking." He got up, knocked loudly on the box, and then put his ear to it. "I can hear someone calling," he said. "It sounds like Paddington. I will try again." He shook the box, and there was an answering thump from inside. "I think he just shut himself in," said Mr. Gruber. He too knocked on the box and called out, "Are you all right, Mr. Brown?" "No," said a small and muffled voice. "It's dark, and I can't read my instruction book." "Quite a good trick," said Mr. Curry. Some while later, after they had praised open Paddington's mystery box with penknife, he helped himself to some biscuits. "The disappearing bear, very unusual, but I still don't see what the flowers were for." Paddington looked at him suspiciously, but Mr. Curry was far too busy with the biscuits. "For my next trick," said Paddington, "I would like a watch." "Are you sure?" asked Mrs. Brown anxiously. "Wouldn't anything else do?" Paddington consulted his instruction book. "It says a watch," he said firmly. Mr. Brown hurriedly pulled his sleeve down over his left wrist. Unfortunately, Mr. Curry, who was in an unusually good mood after his free tea, stood up and offered his. Paddington took it gratefully and placed it on the table. "This is a jolly good trick," he said, reaching down into the box and pulling out a small hammer. He covered the watch with a handkerchief and then hit it several times. Mr. Curry's expression froze. "I hope you know what you're doing, young bear," he said. Paddington looked rather worried. Having turned over the page, he'd just read the ominous words, "It is necessary to have a second watch for this trick." Gingerly, he lifted up a corner of the handkerchief. Several corks and some pieces of glass rolled across the table. Mr. Curry let out a roar of wrath. "I think I forgot to say abracadabra," flattered Paddington. "Abracadabra!" shouted Mr. Curry, beside himself with rage. "Abracadabra!" He held up the remains of his watch. 20 years I've had this watch, and now look at it. This will cost someone a pretty penny." Mr. Gruber took out an eyeglass and examined the watch carefully. "Nonsense," he said, coming to Paddington's rescue. "It's one you bought from me for £3 6 months ago. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, telling lies in front of a young bear." "Rubbish!" spluttered Mr. Curry. He sat down heavily on Paddington's chair. "Rubbish I will give you." His voice trailed away, and a peculiar expression came over his face. "I'm sitting on something," he said. "Something wet and sticky." "Oh dear," said Paddington. "I expect it's my disappearing egg. It must have reappeared." Mr. Curry grew purple in the face. I've never been so insulted in my life, he said. Never. He turned at the door and waved an accusing finger at the company. It's the last time I shall ever come to one of your birthday parties. Henry, said Mrs. Brown as the door closed behind Mr. Curry. You really oughtn't to laugh. Mr. Brown tried hard to keep a straight face. It's no good, he said, bursting out. I can't help it. Did you see his face when all the cocks rolled out? Said Mr. Gruber, his face wet with tears. All the same, said Mr. Brown when the laughter had died down. I think perhaps you ought to try something a little less dangerous next time, Paddington. How about that card trick you were telling me about, Mr. Brown? Asked Mr. Gruber. The one where you tear up a card and make it come out of someone's ear. Yes, that sounds a nice quiet one, said Mrs. Brown. Let's see that. You wouldn't like another disappearing trick? Asked Paddington hopefully. Quite sure, dear, said Mrs. Brown. Well, said Paddington, rummaging in his box. It's not very easy doing card tricks when you've only got pals, but I don't mind trying. He offered a pack of cards to Mr. Gruber, who soundly took one from the middle and then memorized it before replacing the card. Paddington waved his wand over the pack several times, and then withdrew a card. He held up the 7 of spades. Was this it? He said to Mr. Gruber. Mr. Gruber polished his glasses and stared. You know, he said, I do believe it was. I bet all the cards are the same, whispered Mr. Brown to his wife. Shh, said Mrs. Brown. I thought he did it very well. This is the difficult bit, said Paddington, tearing it up. I'm not very sure about this part. He put the pieces under his handkerchief and tapped them several times with the wand. Oh, said Mr. Gruber, rubbing the side of his head. I felt something go pop in my ear just then. Something cold and hard. He felt in his ear. Why, I do believe. He held up a shining round object to the audience. It's a sovereign, my birthday present for Paddington. Now I wonder how it got in there. Oh, said Paddington as he proudly examined it. I didn't expect that. Thank you very much, Mr. Gruber. Well, said Mr. Gruber, it's only a small present, I'm afraid, Mr. Brown, but I've enjoyed the little chats we've had in the mornings. I look forward to them very much and, He cleared his throat and looked around. I'm sure we all hope you have many more birthdays. When the chorus of agreement had died down, Mr. Brown rose and looked at the clock. And now, he said, it's long past all our bad times, most of all yours, Paddington. So I suggest we all do a disappearing trick now. I wish, said Paddington, as he stood at the door waving everyone goodbye. I wish my Aunt Lucy could see me now. She'd feel very pleased. You will have to write and tell her all about it, Paddington, said Mrs. Brown as she took his paw. But in the morning, she added hastily, You've got clean sheets, remember. Yes, said Paddington, in the morning. I expect if I did it now, I'd get ink over the sheets or something. Things are always happening to me. You know, Henry, said Mrs. Brown, as they watched Paddington go up the stairs to bed, looking rather sticky and more than a little sleepy. It's nice having a bear about the house.